When the most desired man in Black Hollow chose the town outcast for his bride, they called it charity. When she stepped into the town square and demanded a dance, they called it madness. But when the music started and Clara Whitmore moved with a grace no one knew she possessed, the laughter died, and the town that had mocked her for 23 years finally fell silent. If you want to see how this story of courage and transformation unfolds, stay until the very end. And please, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The morning of the bride selection dawned cold and merciless over Black Hollow, just like every other spring morning in this godforsaken corner of the frontier. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the town square, her worn boots sinking slightly into the mud, watching as the other young women preened and positioned themselves for the best view of the incoming riders. She shouldn't have come, she knew that, but her mother had insisted, had practically shoved her out the door with a cruel laugh and words that still burned in Clara's ears. Maybe if you stand far enough back, no one will notice you're even here. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her broad shoulders, trying to make herself smaller, a futile effort she'd been attempting her entire life. At 23, she was older than most of the girls gathered here, and twice the size of the delicate, willow-thin beauties who giggled and whispered behind their hands. "Lord have mercy, did you see what Clara's wearing?" The voice belonged to Bethany Morrison, the sheriff's daughter, who never missed an opportunity to remind Clara of her place in Black Hollow's rigid social hierarchy. "That's the same dress she wore to the harvest dance 3 years ago. I'd recognize those stains anywhere." The cluster of young women around Bethany erupted in laughter, not even bothering to lower their voices. Why would they? Everyone in Black Hollow knew that Clara Whitmore was fair game. She'd been the town's favorite target for mockery since childhood, when she'd outgrown her mother's delicate frame and developed into something her mother called unfortunate, and the town called unmarriageable. Clara felt heat creep up her neck but kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where dust clouds signaled the approach of the riders. 5 men from the neighboring counties, all looking for wives. It happened every spring. Men from the isolated ranches and farms would come to towns like Black Hollow, where women outnumbered men 3 to 1, and make their selections. It was a transaction, pure and simple. The men got wives to help run their homesteads and bear their children. The women got a way out of overcrowded towns where opportunities were scarce and futures were bleak. Some of the matches turned into genuine partnerships, even love. Others became quiet tragedies whispered about in sewing circles. Clara had no illusions about where she fell in that equation. She was here because her mother had demanded it, because staying home would have meant facing Louisa Whitmore's wrath, which somehow always managed to be worse than public humiliation. "There they are!" someone called out, and the square erupted in excited chatter. 5 riders crested the hill and began their descent into Black Hollow. Even from a distance, Claire could tell they were a rough bunch, frontiermen, weathered by hard work and harsh seasons. They rode with the easy confidence of people who knew exactly what they wanted and weren't afraid to take it. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. "Ladies, compose yourselves. Gentlemen, welcome to Black Hollow. I trust your journey was uneventful." The lead rider, a burly man with a thick beard, nodded curtly. "We're not here for pleasantries, Sheriff. Let's get on with it." Clara watched as the 5 men dismounted and began their inspection of the assembled women. It was always like this, the men walking down the line, asking questions, sizing up the prospects like they were evaluating livestock at auction. Some of the women blushed and smiled coyly. Others stood with rigid dignity, refusing to play along with the degrading spectacle. Clara stood alone at the far edge of the square, half hidden behind the old oak tree. She told herself she was grateful for the anonymity, but a small, traitorous part of her heart ached with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The men made their way through the line quickly. 2 of them made their selections within minutes, Sarah Brennan and Elizabeth Hayes, both pretty girls from good families. The 3rd man, older and grizzled, chose Martha Thompson, a widow with 3 children who needed a fresh start. That left 2 men and a dozen women, all of whom were beginning to look desperate. Being passed over at a bride selection was a mark of shame that could follow a woman for years. The 4th man, young and cocky, strutted down the line twice before finally settling on Bethany Morrison. The sheriff's daughter preened, clearly delighted with herself, but Clara caught the flash of calculation in the young man's eyes. He'd chosen Bethany for her father's influence, not for any affection. Now only 1 man remained, and he was nothing like the others. Cade Mercer sat astride a massive black horse, surveying the scene with an expression that gave nothing away. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, muscular build that came from years of hard physical labor. His dark hair was slightly too long, falling across a face that would have been handsome if not for the deep scar running from his left temple to his jaw. But it wasn't his appearance that made the remaining women straighten their spines and smooth their skirts. It was the rumors that preceded him. Cade Mercer owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, a sprawling operation that he'd built from nothing after arriving on the frontier 5 years ago. He was wealthy by frontier standards, respected despite his reclusive nature, and had a reputation for being fair but unforgiving. He was also a widower. His first wife had died under circumstances that no one talked about openly, but everyone whispered about in private. Some said it was childbirth. Others claimed it was the harsh winter. A few brave souls suggested it was something darker, though they never dared say what. Clara had heard all the stories. She'd also heard that Cade Mercer hadn't been seen in town since his wife's death 3 years ago, hadn't spoken to anyone beyond what was necessary for business, and had vowed never to remarry. Yet here he was. Sheriff Morrison approached him with an obsequious smile. "Mr. Mercer, this is an unexpected pleasure. We didn't think you'd be joining, I'm here now," Cade interrupted, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "Let's get this done." He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward the line of waiting women. His boots barely made a sound as he moved, and Clara noticed that he held himself with the careful control of someone who'd learned to hide pain. The women practically vibrated with anticipation as he approached. Margaret Stone, a beauty with golden hair and porcelain skin, stepped forward with her most winning smile. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Margaret Stone. My father owns the general store, and I've been told I have quite a talent for—" "Not interested." Cade barely glanced at her as he continued down the line. Margaret's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, stepping back with as much dignity as she could muster. Cade moved methodically, spending no more than a few seconds on each woman. He asked no questions, made no small talk, and showed no reaction to the increasingly desperate attempts to catch his attention. Clara watched it all from her position by the oak tree, feeling something that was equal parts relief and resignation. At least she wouldn't have to face rejection directly. She was so far removed from the selection that she might as well have been invisible, which is exactly what she wanted, wasn't it? Cade reached the end of the line and stood there for a long moment, his back to the crowd. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, he turned around, his expression unreadable. "None of them," he said flatly. Sheriff Morrison's face went red. "Now see here, Mr. Mercer. These are fine young women from good families. I understand you have high standards, but I didn't say they weren't fine." Cade's tone was patient but firm. "I said I'm not interested." He started walking back toward his horse, and Clara felt the tension in the square shift from anticipation to embarrassment. The rejected women looked anywhere but at each other, and several of their mothers had already begun whispering furiously about the insult. Clara knew she should feel relieved. The spectacle was over, and she'd managed to avoid becoming part of it. She could go home, endure her mother's predictable tirade about wasted time, and return to her quiet, invisible existence. But then Cade Mercer stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the square with deliberate precision. And then impossibly, his gaze landed on Clara. For a moment, she thought he was looking at something behind her. She actually glanced over her shoulder to check. But there was nothing there except the old oak tree and the empty stretch of road leading out of town. When she turned back, Cade was walking toward her. The crowd's murmuring stopped abruptly. Every eye in the square fixed on Clara as the most eligible man in 3 counties crossed the muddy ground with purposeful strides. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This had to be a mistake. He must have mistaken her for someone else. Any second now he would realize his error and, "What's your name?" His voice was quieter up close, but no less intense. Clara's mouth went dry. "Clara? Clara Whitmore." "You married Clara Whitmore?" "No, sir." "Promised to anyone?" "No, sir." The response came automatically, even as her mind reeled with confusion. Cade studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds before rain. "You know who I am?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Cade Mercer. You own the Mercer Ranch, about 20 miles west of here." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You always stand this far from everyone else?" The question caught her off guard. Yes, I suppose I do." "Why?" Clara's cheeks burned. "Because they prefer it that way, and so do I." For the first time, Cade's expression shifted into something that might have been understanding. He glanced back at the assembled crowd who were watching the exchange with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination, then returned his attention to Clara. "I need a wife," he said bluntly. "Not for romance or companionship. I need someone who can work hard, learn quickly, and handle the isolation of ranch life. Someone who won't expect pretty words or tender feelings. Someone who understands that marriage is a partnership, not a fairy tale." Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "I'm offering you a choice," Cade continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "You can come with me to the ranch as my wife, or you can stay here. Either way, I'm leaving Black Hollow in an hour." The square erupted in whispers. Clara heard Bethany's voice rise above the others. "He can't be serious, Clara. He's choosing Clara?" But Cade didn't seem to notice or care about the commotion. His entire focus remained on Clara, waiting for her answer. "Why me?" The question tumbled out before Clara could stop it. "Because you're the only one here who didn't try to sell herself," Cade replied. "And because you're the only one who looks like you could survive a real winter." It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't an insult either. It was simply an observation, delivered without malice or pity. Clara's mind raced. This was insane. She didn't know this man. He could be cruel, dangerous, or worse. The rumors about his first wife's death suddenly seemed much more relevant. But then she thought about the alternative. Staying in Black Hollow meant staying with her mother, who made it clear every day that Clara's very existence was a disappointment. It meant enduring the constant mockery, the pitying looks, the slow suffocation of a life that held no possibility for change. "I need to think about it," Clara said, hating how her voice shook. Cade nodded once. "Fair enough. I'll be at the tavern. You have 1 hour." He turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone under the oak tree while the entire town of Black Hollow stared at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Sheriff Morrison was the first to recover. "Now hold on just a minute, Mercer. You can't just—" "I can," Cade interrupted without breaking stride. "And I did. The lady has an hour to decide. I suggest you all give her space to think." He disappeared into the tavern, and the square exploded into chaos. Clara barely registered the noise. Her thoughts were spinning too fast, pulled in too many directions at once. She needed to get away, to think clearly, but before she could move, her mother appeared at her elbow. Louisa Whitmore was a small, delicate woman whose beauty had faded into brittle hardness over the years. She grabbed Clara's arm with surprising strength, her fingernails digging into the fabric of her daughter's sleeve. "Don't you dare ruin this," Louisa hissed, her voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "This is the only chance you'll ever get. If you're stupid enough to turn him down, don't bother coming home." Clara pulled away, her arms stinging where her mother's nails had bitten through the cloth. "I need to think." "There's nothing to think about." Louisa's voice rose sharply. "You're 23 years old, Clara. You're plain, you're large, and you have no prospects. This man is offering you a life. Take it." "Maybe I want to choose my own life," Clara said quietly. Louisa's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You don't have that luxury. None of us do. But at least I was pretty enough to attract a man who wanted me. You're not. So you take what's offered, or you end up alone and bitter, scraping by on other people's charity until the day you die." The words hit like physical blows, but Clara had heard variations of them her entire life. They should have lost their power by now, but they never quite did. "1 hour, Mama," Clara said, stepping back. "I have 1 hour, and I'm going to use it." She turned and walked away before Louisa could respond, heading toward the only place in Black Hollow where she'd ever found any peace, the small cemetery at the edge of town. The graveyard was empty, as it usually was. Most people avoided it unless they had to visit, but Clara had always found comfort in the quiet solitude. She walked among the weathered headstones until she reached a small marker near the back. Emma Whitmore, beloved daughter, Taken too soon. Emma had been Clara's younger sister, the child Louisa had actually wanted. She'd been small and pretty, with golden curls and a sweet disposition. She'd died of fever when she was 7, and Louisa had never forgiven Clara for being the one who survived. "I don't know what to do, Emma," Clara whispered, kneeling beside the grave. "If I stay, nothing will ever change. But if I go with him, I don't know him. I don't know if he's kind or cruel, patient or quick-tempered. I don't know if I'm trading one kind of misery for another." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Clara closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her life would look like in 5 years if she stayed in Black Hollow. The picture that emerged was bleak, still living with her mother, still enduring the town's mockery, still invisible except when people wanted someone to look down upon. Now she tried to imagine life at the Mercer Ranch. That picture was hazier, filled with unknowns and possibilities. It could be terrible, but it could also be, different. "He said I looked like I could survive a real winter," Clara said softly. "Nobody's ever said I looked like I could survive anything before." She stayed in the cemetery for another 20 minutes, weighing her options and trying to quiet the voice in her head that sounded disturbingly like her mother's. Finally, she stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt. "I think I'm going to do something either very brave or very stupid," she told Emma's grave. "If it's stupid, at least I'll be somewhere new when I realize it." The walk back to town felt longer than usual. Clara's steps slowed as she approached the tavern, and she had to physically force herself to keep moving forward. Several townspeople watched her progress with undisguised interest, but no one tried to stop her or offer advice. The tavern was dim and smoky, smelling of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Clara had been inside exactly twice in her life, both times to deliver messages for her mother. She paused in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Cade Mercer sat at a corner table, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. Clara crossed the room on shaking legs and stopped in front of his table. "I have some conditions." One dark eyebrow rose slightly. "Go on." "I won't be treated like a servant or a broodmare," Clara said, forcing strength into her voice. "I'll work hard, and I'll learn whatever you need me to learn. But I expect to be treated with basic respect. And if," her voice faltered slightly, "if you ever raise a hand to me, I'll leave. I don't care how far I have to walk or where I end up." Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Bare terms. I have one of my own." "What is it?" "Honesty. If something's wrong, you tell me. If you need something, you ask. If you hate ranch life after a month and want out, you say so. I won't tolerate silent suffering or martyrdom. Deal?" Clara extended her hand and Cade shook it. His grip was firm but not crushing, his palm calloused from years of hard work. "Deal," Clara said. "When do we leave?" "Now, unless you need time to pack." Clara thought about the sparse contents of her room at her mother's house. A few worn dresses, some books, and not much else. Nothing she couldn't live without. "I'm ready," she said. Cade stood, draining his whiskey in one swallow. "Then let's go." They walked out of the tavern together, and Clara felt every eye in Black Hollow on her back. Cade led her to where his horse was tethered, then turned to face the assembled crowd. "Clara Whitmore has agreed to be my wife," he announced, his voice carrying across the square. "We'll be married at my ranch by the circuit preacher when he comes through next month. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. No one spoke. Cade mounted his horse in one smooth motion, then reached down to help Clara up. She'd never ridden a horse before, and the ground seemed impossibly far away. But she gripped his hand and let him pull her up behind him, settling awkwardly into position. "Hold on," Cade said quietly. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. The horse shifted beneath them, and then they were moving, leaving Black Hollow behind. As they rode out of town, Clara caught a glimpse of her mother standing in front of the general store. Louisa's face was twisted with an emotion Clara couldn't quite identify. Triumph, perhaps, or relief at finally being rid of her disappointing daughter. Clara turned away and didn't look back. The ride to the Mercer Ranch took nearly 3 hours, following a winding trail through increasingly wild terrain. Cade didn't speak, and Clara was grateful for the silence. She needed time to process what she'd just done. To come to terms with the fact that she'd left everything familiar behind on the word of a stranger. The landscape changed as they rode, transforming from the scrubby grasslands around Black Hollow to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. Clara had never been this far from town before, and the sheer vastness of the empty land was both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they crested a hill and Clara saw the ranch spread out below them. It was larger than she'd imagined, a sprawling compound centered around a sturdy two-story house built from rough-hewn logs. There was a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what looked like miles of fencing stretching across the valley. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "This is it," Cade said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving Black Hollow. "The Mercer Ranch." He guided the horse down the hill and through a wooden gate. As they approached the main house, Clara noticed details she'd missed from a distance. The neat garden beside the house, the well-maintained equipment, the general sense of order and purpose. Cade dismounted and helped Clara down. Her legs wobbled after hours on horseback, and she had to grip his shoulder for balance. "Take a minute," he said, not unkindly. "First time on a horse always leaves you unsteady." While Clara regained her balance, Cade led the horse to the barn. She watched him work, noting the easy efficiency of his movements as he unsaddled the animal and began brushing it down. "Do you have other horses?" Clara asked, grateful for any excuse to fill the awkward silence. "4, counting this one. Thunder here is my riding horse. The others are work horses, Steady, Boulder, and Rain." "Those are unusual names. They're honest names." Cade glanced at her briefly. "Thunder's got a temperament like a storm. Steady never gets rattled. Boulder's built like a rock. And Rain, well, she showed up during a downpour and never left." Despite herself, Clara smiled. "And you just kept her?" Seemed wrong to turn away something that clearly wanted to stay. He finished with the horse and gestured toward the house. "Come on, I'll show you around before dark." The interior of the house was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's domain. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean, if a bit stark. "2 bedrooms upstairs," Cade said, pointing to a narrow staircase. "You can take the one on the left. I'm on the right." Clara felt relief wash through her. She'd been dreading the question of sleeping arrangements, worried that Cade would expect immediate intimacy despite his earlier claims about marriage being a partnership. "There's a washroom out back," Cade continued. "Water pump is by the kitchen. I'll show you where everything is tomorrow, but for now, you should rest. It's been a long day." He started to leave, then paused. "There's bread and cheese in the larder if you're hungry. Help yourself to whatever you need." After he left, Clara stood in the middle of the main room trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. This morning, she'd been Clara Whitmore, the town pariah, living in her mother's shadow. Now she was what exactly? Not quite a wife, not quite a stranger, something in between, uncertain and undefined. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs still unsteady from the ride. The bedroom on the left was small but comfortable, with a single bed covered in a simple quilt, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the valley. Someone, Cade presumably, had left a clean nightgown folded on the bed. Clara changed out of her traveling clothes and crawled under the quilt, expecting to lie awake for hours, her mind churning with anxiety and second thoughts. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the unfamiliar quiet of the frontier night and the surprising comfort of a bed that was entirely her own. She woke to the sound of movement downstairs and pale dawn light filtering through her window. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The bride selection, Cade's unexpected proposal, the long ride to the ranch. Clara dressed quickly in the same clothes from yesterday and made her way downstairs. Cade was at the stove, cooking something that filled the house with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He glanced up when she appeared. "Morning? Coffee?" "Please." He poured her a cup from the pot on the stove, then returned to his cooking. Clara sat at the rough wooden table, warming her hands on the mug and trying to think of something to say. "Sleep all right?" Cade asked, breaking the silence. "Better than I expected, actually." "Good. You'll need your strength. Today we start your training." Clara set down her coffee. "Training?" Ranch work, Kate explained, sliding a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her. If you're going to live here, you need to know how things work. How to care for the animals, repair equipment, handle yourself in bad weather. The frontier doesn't forgive ignorance. I've never done any of that before, Clara admitted. I know. That's why I'm going to teach you. He sat down across from her with his own plate. Eat up. We've got a lot to cover. The next weeks blurred into a grueling routine of learning and adaptation. Cade proved to be a patient but demanding teacher, showing Clara everything from mucking out stalls to mending fences to identifying which plants were edible and which were poisonous. He taught her to ride, spending hours each day in the corral until she could mount, dismount, and control a horse with reasonable confidence. He showed her how to milk the cows, gather eggs, and slaughter chickens without flinching. Death is part of life out here, he said matter-of-factly when she hesitated over her first kill. If you can't handle it, you'll starve come winter, Clara learned. She had blisters on her hands from handling tools, bruises on her legs from getting thrown by horses, and muscles she didn't know she had that screamed in protest every morning. But she learned. What surprised her most was Cade himself. He was nothing like she'd expected. Yes, he was quiet and reserved, rarely offering more than a few words at a time. But he was never cruel, never impatient beyond reason, and never dismissive of her questions or mistakes. When she struggled to saddle a horse properly, he showed her 3 different techniques until she found one that worked for her strength and height. When she burned dinner beyond recognition, he simply opened a can of beans and said, "Tomorrow we'll work on temperature control." He treated her, Clara realized with growing wonder, like a person. Not a burden, not a joke, not a disappointment, just a person learning new skills. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Clara was in the barn tending to the horses when she heard unfamiliar voices outside. She stepped to the doorway and saw 3 men on horseback talking to Cade. They were rough-looking characters, armed and watchful. Clara's instinct was to hide, but something in Cade's posture, rigid, alert, made her stay visible. "Just passing through," the lead rider was saying, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Thought we might water our horses, maybe get a meal." "Water's free," Cade replied evenly, "but I've got nothing to spare for meals." "That's not very neighborly." The man's gaze slid past Cade and landed on Clara. "Especially when you've got a woman who could cook for us." Clara felt ice slide down her spine, but before she could react, Cade shifted position, blocking the man's view. "The lady's not available," Cade said, and there was steel in his voice now. "You're welcome to the water. Then I suggest you move along." The tension stretched taut. The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, the leader shrugged. "No offense meant, we'll just water up and be on our way." They did exactly that, filling their canteens at the pump while Cade watched every move. Once they'd ridden off, he turned to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Who were they?" "Drifters, maybe worse." Cade's expression was grim. "That's why you need to learn to handle a rifle. Come on." He led her to the house and pulled out a Winchester rifle from above the fireplace. "This is staying loaded from now on. I'm going to teach you how to use it." I know. But you're going to learn." His tone left no room for argument. "The frontier's dangerous, Clara, especially for women alone. I can't always be here to protect you, so you need to be able to protect yourself." They spent the next hour in shooting practice, Cade patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could at least hit the target more often than she missed it. When they finally stopped, Clara's shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and her ears were ringing. "You did well," Cade said, and Clara felt a small glow of pride at the praise. "Keep practicing. A month from now, you'll be able to drop a coyote at 50 yards. As they walked back to the house, Clara found herself studying Cade's profile in the fading light. She knew almost nothing about his past, about the man behind the scarred face and careful control, but she was starting to understand something important. He was teaching her these skills not because he wanted her to be useful, but because he wanted her to survive. That night, as they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace, their evening routine had evolved into a quiet hour of reading or mending before bed. Clara finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you choose me? In Black Hollow, I mean. You could have had any of those women." Cade looked up from the harness he was repairing, his expression thoughtful. "I told you, you were the only one who wasn't trying to sell yourself. But there has to be more to it than that." He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara thought he might not answer. Then he set down the harness and met her gaze directly. "My first wife was beautiful," he said slowly, "delicate, like a porcelain doll. Everyone said I was lucky to have her." His jaw tightened. "She hated it here, hated the isolation, the work, the endless seasons. She smiled through it for a while, pretended she was fine, but the frontier broke her." Clara's breath caught. This was more than Cade had said about his past in all the weeks she'd been here. How did she die? The question was barely a whisper. "Winter," Cade said flatly. "She went out to check on the chickens during a storm. Never made it back to the house. I found her frozen 20 feet from the door. She'd gotten turned around in the whiteout, couldn't find her way." He paused, his expression distant. "The doctor said it was quick, but I knew better. She'd been dying slowly ever since we got married, suffocating under the weight of a life she never wanted." "I'm sorry," Clara said, inadequate as the words were. "Don't be. It wasn't your fault." Cade picked up the harness again, his hands resuming their steady work. "When I came to Black Hollow, I wasn't looking for beauty or refinement. I was looking for someone who could survive, someone who looked like they'd already survived things. And when I saw you standing there under that oak tree, apart from everyone else but still standing, I thought maybe you were strong enough for this life." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a knot she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "You thought I was strong?" "I knew you were strong," Cade corrected. "Anyone who's endured what you've clearly endured and still has kindness in their eyes, that's the kind of strength that matters out here." They fell back into comfortable silence, but Clara's mind was spinning. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen not her size or her plainness or her awkwardness, but her strength. And not just any someone, a man who understood exactly what kind of strength the frontier demanded. The weeks continued to pass, and Clara continued to learn and adapt. She could now saddle a horse without help, shoot well enough to hit what she aimed at, and even cook a passable stew. Her hands had developed calluses that protected against blisters, and her muscles had grown accustomed to the daily demands of ranch life. But more than her physical capabilities, something else was changing. Clara was changing. She was starting to move through the world with a confidence she'd never known before. Secure in the knowledge that she was capable, that she was learning, that she was, against all odds, thriving. Cade noticed. She could tell by the way his rare smiles became slightly less rare, by the way he sometimes let her take the lead on tasks he'd previously supervised, by the small nod of approval when she handled something particularly well. Their relationship remained undefined. Not quite a conventional marriage, but something deeper than a simple working partnership. They existed in a comfortable middle ground, learning each other's rhythms and habits, building something that felt almost like friendship. Almost. Then came the day the circuit preacher arrived, riding in on a swayback mule with his Bible tucked under his arm. "Heard you needed marrying," he announced cheerfully. "Cade Mercer and Clara Whitmore, is it?" Clara felt her stomach drop. In the chaos of learning ranch life, she'd almost forgotten about this part. The actual wedding. The moment when this arrangement would become legally binding and permanent. She glanced at Cade, who was watching her with that steady, unreadable expression. "Your choice," he said quietly. "Still is." And Clara realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she wanted this. Not out of desperation or lack of options, but because this life, hard as it was, felt more real and more honest than anything she'd left behind in Black Hollow. "I'm ready," she said. The ceremony was brief and practical, conducted in the main room of the house with just the three of them present. The preacher rattled through the words with well-practiced efficiency, and when he got to the part about "speak now or forever hold your peace," Clara half expected her mother's voice to echo from the walls. But there was only silence, and the preacher's cheerful, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Cade paid the preacher with a dozen eggs and a side of bacon, and they watched him ride off toward his next appointment. Clara stood on the porch, watching the preacher's figure grow smaller in the distance, and felt Cade's presence beside her. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Clara glanced at him sideways. "Does this change anything?" "Everything," Cade replied. "And nothing. We're legally bound now, which means you've got claim to half of everything here. As for the rest..." He shrugged slightly. That's up to us to figure out. It was such a Cade response, honest, practical, leaving room for possibility without demanding anything. Clara found herself smiling. Well then, she said, I suppose we should get back to work. Those fences won't mend themselves. Cade's answering smile was small but genuine. No, they won't. They walked back to work together, husband and wife in name and law, and Clara felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Hope. Not the desperate, fluttering hope of her younger years, always destined for disappointment, but something steadier and more durable. The hope that comes from discovering you're stronger than you ever knew, that you can build something real from the most unlikely beginning. Behind them, the Mercer Ranch stretched across the valley, solid and enduring. Ahead of them lay the coming winter, the inevitable challenges, and the slow work of turning strangers into partners. But for now, in this perfect autumn afternoon, Clara walked beside her husband toward the waiting work, and for the first time in 23 years, she didn't feel the need to make herself smaller. She had found, in the most unexpected place and the most unlikely way, a space where she could finally, fully exist. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley with white, while November was still young. Clara woke to find frost patterns etched across her bedroom window, and the world outside transformed into something crystalline and strange. She dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, layering on the warm clothes Cade had helped her acquire from the traveling merchant who'd passed through 2 weeks earlier. The wool felt scratchy against her skin, but she'd learned that comfort was a luxury the frontier rarely afforded. Downstairs, Cade was already stoking the fire, his movements economical in the cold morning air. He looked up when she descended, his breath forming small clouds in the chill. Winter's announcing itself, he said, gesturing toward the window. We've got maybe 2 weeks before the real storms hit. Today we start preparing in earnest. Clara poured herself coffee from the pot he'd already brewed, grateful for the warmth seeping through the tin cup into her palms. What needs doing? Everything. Cade's tone was matter-of-fact rather than grim. We need to move the cattle to the winter pasture, reinforce the barn roof, stock the root cellar, cut enough firewood to last till spring, and check every inch of fencing. If something fails during a blizzard, we won't be able to fix it until the thaw. The enormity of the task list would have overwhelmed Clara 3 months ago. Now she simply nodded and reached for her coat. Where do we start? Something flickered across Cade's face. Approval, perhaps, or satisfaction. The cattle. That's a 2-day job, and we need to get it done before the next storm rolls in. They worked through that day and the next with barely a moment's rest, moving the herd across miles of increasingly frozen ground to the sheltered valley where they'd spend the winter. Clara learned to read the cattle's movements, to anticipate when one might bolt or balk, to work in tandem with Cade and the dogs to keep the animals moving in the right direction. By the time they drove the last cow through the gate of the winter pasture, Clara's entire body ached with exhaustion, but there was satisfaction in it too, the bone-deep knowledge that she'd accomplished something real and necessary. You did well, Cade said as they rode back toward the ranch in the gathering dusk. Better than most first-timers. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with exertion. Praise from Cade was rare enough to be precious. I had a good teacher. You had the right instincts. I just pointed you in the right direction. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses' hooves crunching through the thin layer of snow. Then Cade spoke again, his voice thoughtful. We'll need to make a trip to Black Hollow before the heavy snows come. Stock up on supplies we can't produce ourselves. Flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. Things we'll need to last the winter. Clara's hands tightened on the reins. She hadn't been back to Black Hollow since the day she'd left. Hadn't seen her mother or Bethany Morrison or any of the people who'd spent years making her feel small and worthless. How soon? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. Week at most. The weather's turning faster than I expected. Cade glanced at her, and she knew he'd caught the tension in her posture. You don't have to see anyone you don't want to. We can be in and out in a few hours. It's fine, Clara lied. It doesn't bother me. Cade didn't respond, but she saw the skeptical tilt of his eyebrow. He'd gotten better at reading her over the past months, just as she'd learned to interpret his silences and small gestures. The week passed in a blur of preparation. They cut firewood until Clara's shoulders screamed in protest, stacked it in neat cords against the side of the house, and covered it with tarps weighted down against the wind. They harvested the last of the root vegetables and stored them in the cellar, packed the barn with hay for the horses, and went through every piece of equipment to make sure nothing would fail when it was needed most. Through it all, Clara tried not to think about the inevitable return to Black Hollow. But as the day approached, she found herself growing increasingly anxious, snapping at small frustrations and lying awake at night rehearsing imaginary confrontations. The morning they were set to leave, Cade found her standing in front of the small mirror in her room, trying and failing to make herself look presentable. "You look fine," he said from the doorway. Clara turned, embarrassed to be caught in such obvious vanity. "I look the same as I always have." "Exactly." Cade stepped into the room, his expression serious. "You look like someone who's been working a ranch for 3 months. Strong, capable, honest. That's better than fine." "They're going to laugh at me," Clara said quietly, "just like they always have." "Maybe." Cade crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "But here's what they won't be able to do. They won't be able to make you small anymore. Because you know now what you're capable of. You've moved cattle through a storm, shot a coyote that was threatening the chickens, and learned more about survival in 3 months than most of those people will know in their entire lives. So let them laugh. You know the truth." Clara studied his face, searching for pity or condescension, but found only steady confidence. "You really believe that?" "I know it, and so should you." The ride to Black Hollow took most of the morning. As they drew closer, Clara felt her anxiety building with each familiar landmark. The old lightning-struck tree, the bend in the river where children went swimming in summer, the cluster of houses that marked the town's outer edge. Nothing had changed. Everything looked exactly as it had when she'd left, as though the entire town had been frozen in time while Clara's life had transformed completely. They rode into the main square just after noon, and Clara felt the familiar weight of attention settle over her like a physical thing. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned to stare. Within moments, word would spread through Black Hollow that Clara Whitmore had returned, or rather Clara Mercer, though the new name still felt strange on her tongue. Cade dismounted and helped Clara down, his hand lingering at her elbow in a gesture that felt protective without being possessive. "General store first," he said, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. "Then the feed merchant. We'll be gone before nightfall." They walked toward the general store together, and Clara could feel eyes tracking their progress. She kept her chin up and her gaze forward, channeling every ounce of the strength Cade insisted she possessed. Inside the store, Mr. Stone stood behind the counter, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Mercer? Mrs. Mercer, what can I do for you?" Cade handed him a list. "We need supplies for winter. Everything on here, plus whatever lamp oil you can spare." While Mr. Stone began gathering items, the door opened behind them. Clara didn't need to turn around to know who'd entered. Bethany Morrison's distinctive laugh was unmistakable. "Well, well, look who decided to grace us with her presence." Bethany's voice dripped with false sweetness. "How's married life treating you, Clara? Or should I say, how's charity work treating our dear Mr. Mercer?" Clara felt heat creep up her neck, but before she could respond, Cade turned around slowly. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, addressing Bethany with deliberate formality despite her unmarried status. "If you have something to say about my wife, you can say it to me directly." Bethany's smile faltered slightly. "I didn't mean any offense. I'm just surprised you're still together, is all." Everyone thought wrong." Cade's voice was flat and final. "Clara's the best partner I could have asked for. She works harder than any 2 men I've hired, learns faster than anyone I've taught, and handles frontier life better than most people born to it. If that sounds like charity to you, then I question your understanding of the word." The store had gone completely silent. Even Mr. Stone had stopped gathering supplies to listen. Bethany's face flushed red. "I was just making conversation." "No, you were making assumptions. There's a difference." Cade turned back to the counter, dismissing her entirely. "Mr. Stone, how's that order coming?" "Almost done, sir." Mr. Stone worked faster, clearly eager to diffuse the tension. Bethany stood there for another moment, visibly struggling between outrage and embarrassment, then fled the store with her head held high and her pride in tatters. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Cade glanced at her. "No one talks about my wife that way, not in my hearing." The words sent a strange warmth through Clara's chest. He defended her not out of pity or obligation, but because he genuinely meant what he'd said. She was his partner, and he valued her. They finished their shopping without further incident, though Clara caught whispers and sidelong glances everywhere they went. At the feed merchants, they ran into Sheriff Morrison himself. Mercer. The sheriff's greeting was cordial but cautious. Heard you two tied the knot. Congratulations. Thank you, Sheriff. Cade's tone gave nothing away. Morrison's gaze shifted to Clara, and she saw calculation in his eyes. Clara, your mother's been asking after you, says she hasn't heard from you since you left. I've been busy learning ranch work, Clara replied evenly. There hasn't been time for letters. Still, she is your mother. Might be Christian of you to pay her a visit while you're in town. The suggestion landed like a stone in Clara's stomach. The last thing she wanted was to face Louisa Whitmore, but she knew that refusing would give the town fresh ammunition for gossip. Where is she? Clara asked, resigned to the inevitable. At the boarding house. Took a room there after you left. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but Clara caught the implication. Her mother had moved out of their small house, probably unable or unwilling to maintain it alone. Cade touched Clara's arm lightly. I'll finish up here. You do what you need to do. Clara nodded, grateful for the escape from his scrutiny, even though she dreaded what came next. She walked to the boarding house on legs that felt like lead, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation she'd hoped to avoid. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the place, directed Clara to the second floor, third door on the right. Clara knocked, and her mother's voice called out, "Come in!" Louisa Whitmore sat in a rocking chair by the window, thinner than Clara remembered and somehow diminished. The room was small and shabby, a far cry from the house where Clara had grown up. "So you finally decided to show your face," Louisa said by way of greeting. "Hello, Mother." Clara remained standing, unwilling to settle in for a long visit. "Sheriff Morrison said you wanted to see me." "Wanted?" Louisa's laugh was bitter. "I expected basic decency from my only living daughter. Apparently that was too much to ask." "I've been busy. Busy playing house with a man who married you out of pity." Louisa's eyes were sharp and cruel. "Do you think I don't know what people are saying? That Cade Mercer felt sorry for the town joke and decided to perform an act of charity? You may have fooled yourself, Clara, but you haven't fooled anyone else." The words stung, but they lacked the devastating power they once would have had. Clara had heard Cade defend her in the general store, had felt the genuine respect in his voice when he spoke about her work. Her mother's poison couldn't erase that. "Think what you like," Clara said quietly. "I know the truth of my marriage, even if you don't." "Oh, you know, do you?" Louisa stood, her movements sharp with anger. "You know that he's using you for labor? That you're nothing more than hired help who cooks and cleans and warms his bed?" "I don't warm his bed." The correction came automatically, and Clara immediately regretted it. Louisa's eyebrows shot up. "He doesn't even want you that way? Oh, Clara, you poor deluded child. He really did marry you for charity." "He married me because he needed a partner who could survive the frontier," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "Someone strong and capable, and that's what I've become." "You've become a workhorse," Louisa spat, "just like I always knew you would. Congratulations, you've achieved your full potential." Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not the terrifying figure of her childhood, but a bitter, disappointed woman who'd spent her life blaming others for her unhappiness. And suddenly, Clara felt something unexpected. Pity. "I'm sorry you're alone," Clara said softly. "I'm sorry life didn't turn out the way you wanted. But I'm not responsible for your disappointment, and I won't let you poison what I'm building with your bitterness." "Building?" Louisa's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You're not building anything. You're surviving, barely, in a life that will break you just like it broke his first wife. And when winter comes and you're trapped in that isolated ranch with a man who doesn't love you, you'll remember this conversation and realize I was right." Clara walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. "You've been telling me I'm worthless my entire life. For a long time I believed you, but I don't anymore. Cade sees value in me that you never could, and I've discovered strength I never knew I had. So your words don't have power over me anymore, Mother. I'm done letting you define who I am." She left before Louisa could respond. walking down the stairs and out of the boarding house with her heart pounding but her head held high. Cade was waiting by the horses, the supplies already loaded. He took one look at Clara's face and asked, "You all right?" "I will be." Clara took the reins he offered. "Can we leave now?" "Already packed and ready." They rode out of Black Hollow at a steady pace, not rushing, but not lingering either. Clara didn't look back at the boarding house or the general store or any of the familiar streets. There was nothing for her here anymore, if there ever had been. They were several miles out of town when Cade finally broke the silence. "Want to talk about it?" Clara considered, then shook her head. "She said the things she always says. They just don't hurt the way they used to." "That's growth," Cade observed. "Painful kind, but growth nonetheless." "She said you married me out of pity," Clara heard herself say. "That I'm just hired help." Cade was quiet for a moment, and Clara braced herself for whatever was coming. Then he said, "You know what I paid my last hired hand?" "What?" $20 a month, plus room and board. He lasted 3 weeks before the isolation drove him off. Cade glanced at her with something that might have been amusement. If you're hired help, you're severely underpaid and vastly overqualified. Despite herself, Clara laughed. "That's your response? What do you want me to say? That I didn't marry you out of pity?" Cade shrugged. "I didn't. I married you because you looked like you could survive what needed surviving. And I was right. In 3 months, you've learned more and adapted faster than anyone I've ever worked with. So if your mother wants to call that charity, let her. We both know better." They rode in silence for a while, and Clara felt the knot of tension in her chest slowly unwind. Cade had a gift for cutting through emotional complexity to get at simple truth, and right now, she needed that clarity. "The town thinks we're a joke," Clara said eventually. "They think our marriage is some kind of mistake or rebellion or act of temporary insanity." "Let them think it." Cade's tone was unconcerned. "Their opinions don't keep us fed or warm. Our work does." "Doesn't it bother you at all? The gossip?" "Used to. When Sarah died, people whispered for months, made up stories about what really happened, why she was outside during the storm, whether I'd driven her to it." His jaw tightened slightly. "I learned that people will think what they want to think regardless of the truth. Best you can do is live honestly and let the gossip blow past like wind." Clara absorbed this wisdom as they continued their journey home. The ranch appeared in the distance just as the sun began its descent, the buildings dark against the golden light. She'd only been gone for a day, but the sight of it filled her with something that felt remarkably like joy. Home. When had she started thinking of the Mercer Ranch as home? Over the next week, they fell back into their routine of preparation. The weather grew colder, the days shorter, and the work more urgent. They were racing against the calendar now, trying to finish everything before winter locked them in. One afternoon, while Clara was in the barn organizing feed sacks, she heard horses approaching. She grabbed the rifle Cade insisted she keep nearby and moved to the door, peering out cautiously. 2 riders were coming up the valley road, a man and a woman, both well-dressed for traveling. Clara's hand tightened on the rifle until she saw Cade emerge from the equipment shed, his posture relaxed. "That's the Bishops," he called to Clara. "Neighbors from 20 miles east. No threat." Clara lowered the rifle but kept it close as the couple dismounted. The woman was petite and pretty, with dark hair tucked under a practical bonnet. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a friendly face weathered by sun and wind. "Cade," the woman called cheerfully, "we heard you'd gone and gotten yourself married. Had to come see if the rumors were true." "They're true." Cade gestured toward Clara. "This is my wife, Clara. Clara, this is Margaret and Thomas Bishop. They run cattle on the eastern range." Margaret's eyes lit up as she approached Clara, and before Clara could react, the smaller woman had pulled her into an enthusiastic hug. "Oh, I'm so glad. I've been the only woman within a day's ride for 2 years now. Do you know how wonderful it is to have another female neighbor?" Clara returned the hug awkwardly, unused to such open affection. "It's nice to meet you." "Nice. It's magnificent." Margaret pulled back, beaming. "You must come visit. Or better yet, we'll visit you, before the snow gets too deep for travel." "Oh, Thomas, isn't this wonderful?" Thomas Bishop grinned indulgently at his wife's enthusiasm. "She's been desperate for female company. Fair warning, Clara. She's going to want to know everything about you." "Not everything," Margaret protested. "Just the important things, like how you managed to catch our elusive Cade, who swore up and down he'd never marry again. Cade's expression remained neutral, but Clara caught the slight tightening around his eyes. It wasn't like that. Oh? Margaret's tone was teasing. Then how was it? Because the traveling merchants are having a field day with the story. One said you chose her from a lineup like picking produce at market. That's actually not far from the truth, Clara said before Cade could respond. It was a bride selection in Black Hollow. Cade was one of several men looking for wives. Margaret's eyes widened. One of those frontier matchings? I've heard about them, but never met anyone who actually... She cut herself off, clearly realizing her enthusiasm might be insensitive. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It was practical, Clara said, echoing Cade's usual pragmatism. And it worked out. It certainly did, Thomas agreed. Cade looks happier than I've seen him in years. No offense, friend. None taken. Cade's tone suggested the conversation was making him uncomfortable. You two want coffee? Or did you ride all this way just to interrogate us? Both, Margaret said cheerfully. Definitely both. They spent the afternoon sharing coffee and conversation in the main room, and Clara found herself genuinely enjoying Margaret's company. The other woman was warm and funny, with a sharp wit and a wealth of stories about frontier life. She treated Clara like an equal rather than an oddity, asking about her experiences learning ranch work with genuine interest. The first time I had to butcher a chicken, I cried for an hour, Margaret confided. Thomas finally had to do it himself because I was making such a mess of things. But you learn, don't you? You have to. You do, Clara agreed, grateful for the understanding. As the sun began to set, the bishops prepared to leave. Margaret pulled Clara aside while the men were checking the horses. Listen, she said quietly, I know we just met, but I want you to know, if you ever need anything, anything at all, you can come to us. The frontier can be isolating, especially for women, and winter... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Winter can be hard. If you need company or help or just someone to talk to, our door is always open. Clara felt unexpected emotion tighten her throat. Thank you. That means more than you know. I do know. Margaret squeezed her hand. I was terrified my first winter. Thought I'd go mad from the silence and the endless snow. Having Thomas helped, but having another woman to talk to would have made all the difference. So please, remember, you're not alone out here. After the bishops left, Clara and Cade stood on the porch watching the dust from their horses' hooves settle in the fading light. They're good people, Cade said. Thomas helped me build the barn when I first started the ranch. Margaret brought food when Sarah died, even though she barely knew us. Margaret said winter can be hard, Clara ventured. She seemed worried about me. Cade was silent for a long moment. The first winter is always the hardest. Months of being snowed in, no visitors, nothing but work and survival. Some people can't handle it. The isolation breaks them. He glanced at her. But you're stronger than most people. You'll be fine. Clara wanted to believe him, but Margaret's concern had planted seeds of doubt. What if she wasn't as strong as Cade thought? What if the endless white silence drove her mad the way it had apparently driven Sarah? But there was no time to dwell on such fears. The first major storm arrived 3 days later, dumping 2 feet of snow across the valley in a single night. Clara woke to a world transformed, everything buried under pristine white, the familiar landscape rendered strange and new. Welcome to winter, Cade said, handing her a steaming cup of coffee. From now until spring, this is our life. Snow, cold, and the constant work of survival. He wasn't exaggerating. The next weeks became a relentless cycle of shoveling paths between buildings, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling feed to livestock, and keeping the fires burning. Clara's muscles ached constantly, and she fell into bed each night too exhausted for dreams. But she also discovered something unexpected. She didn't mind it. The hard work gave her purpose and structure. The isolation that had worried Margaret didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. Without the constant scrutiny of townspeople, without her mother's criticism and the weight of others' expectations, Clara found she could simply exist. She and Cade developed a rhythm during those long winter days. They worked together in comfortable silence, their movements coordinated from months of practice. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Cade reading or repairing equipment, Clara mending clothes or working on the embroidery project Margaret had sent home with her. Sometimes they talked. Cade shared stories about his early days on the frontier, the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. Clara found herself opening up about her childhood, about Emma and her mother, and the slow accumulation of hurts that had shaped her. "You deserved better," Cade said one night after Clara had finished a particularly difficult story about her mother's cruelty. "Maybe, but I got what I got. And somehow it led me here, which is better than anything I had before." Cade looked at her across the firelight, his expression thoughtful. "You really mean that?" "I do." Clara set down her embroidery. "I know our marriage isn't conventional. I know we're not what most people would consider a real couple. But this life, this partnership, it's honest. And after spending 23 years surrounded by dishonesty and pretense, honest feels like the greatest gift anyone could have given me." Something shifted in Cade's expression, a softening, a warming. "It's honest," he agreed quietly, "and it's enough." The word hung between them, loaded with meaning Clara didn't quite know how to parse. Enough for what? For now? For always? She wanted to ask, but the moment felt too fragile for questions. Instead, she picked up her embroidery and returned to work. And Cade went back to his book, and the evening continued in peaceful silence. But that night, lying in her bed with winter wind howling outside, Clara found herself thinking about that word. Enough. Was their partnership enough for her? Was it enough for Cade? And what would happen if one of them eventually wanted more? The questions followed her into restless sleep, unanswered and unsettling. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every movement outside a calculated risk. Clara learned to read the sky for signs of incoming storms, to judge temperature by the creak of frozen wood, to navigate by landmarks half buried in snowdrifts that reshaped the landscape weekly. She also learned something more surprising. She was good at this life, better than good. Where Sarah had apparently withered under the isolation, Clara bloomed. The quiet didn't frighten her, it freed her. Without the constant chorus of mockery that had defined her existence in Black Hollow, she discovered who she actually was beneath all those years of self-protection and shame. One particularly brutal morning in late January, Clara woke to find Cade already dressed and pulling on his heaviest coat. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Big one. I can smell it in the air. We need to get the cattle moved to the near shelter before it hits, or we'll lose half the herd." Clara dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and haste. They'd moved cattle before, but never with a major storm bearing down. The animals sensed the weather change too, and were skittish, harder to control than usual. They worked for hours in the biting wind, pushing the reluctant cattle toward the sheltered ravine where they'd be protected from the worst of the storm. Clara's face went numb, her fingers ached inside her gloves, but she kept moving, kept working alongside Cade with the grim determination she'd learned was necessary for survival. They were almost done, just a dozen stragglers left to round up, when Clara spotted movement on the ridge above them. A cow, separated from the herd, struggling through a drift with something small and dark beside her. "Cade," Clara pointed. "That cow's got a calf." Cade swore under his breath. "Damn fool animal calved early. The calf won't survive if we leave it up there." He assessed the distance, the darkening sky, the wind that was already starting to pick up in earnest. "I'll go get them." "You finish moving these last few—" "We'll both go," Clara interrupted. "It'll be faster with two." For a moment she thought Cade might argue, might insist on protecting her from the risk, but he simply nodded. "Stay close. If the storm hits before we're down, we make for the ravine immediately. The cattle matter, but not more than our lives." They climbed the ridge together, fighting through snow that sometimes reached Clara's thighs. The cow was bawling frantically, trying to keep her newborn calf warm with her own body heat, but the little creature was already shivering violently. "Grab the calf," Cade commanded. "I'll lead the cow down." Clara scooped up the calf, surprised by how light it was, how fragile. She could feel its heartbeat racing against her chest as she tucked it inside her coat for warmth. The cow followed Cade with surprising docility, maternal instinct overriding her usual wariness. They were halfway down the ridge when the storm hit in earnest. One moment, Clara could see the ravine ahead, the dark shapes of the sheltered cattle. The next, the world disappeared behind a wall of white. The wind screamed, driving snow horizontally, stealing breath and sight and sound. "Clara!" Cade's voice barely reached her over the roar of the storm. Stay with me! Follow my voice! Clara stumbled forward, clutching the calf, trying to keep Cade's dark shape in view. But the whiteout was disorienting, making direction meaningless. She could barely see her own feet, let alone the treacherous terrain beneath them. Her boot caught on something, a root, a rock, she couldn't tell. And she went down hard. The calf bleated in terror as they tumbled together down a slope Clara hadn't known was there. She hit the ground at the bottom with jarring force, the air knocked from her lungs. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only lie there gasping while snow accumulated on her face. Then strong hands grabbed her shoulders, hauling her upright. Clara, are you hurt? Cade's face was inches from hers, his eyes wide with fear she'd never seen before. I'm fine, Clara wheezed. The calf. The little creature was still tucked against her chest, still breathing. Clara carefully extracted it and checked for injuries while Cade ran his hands over her arms and legs with professional efficiency. Nothing broken, he announced. But we can't stay here. The ravine's just ahead. Can you walk? Clara nodded and they pushed forward together, moving by instinct more than sight. When they finally stumbled into the relative shelter of the ravine, Clara nearly wept with relief. The cattle were huddled together, and the wind, while still fierce, wasn't the murderous force it had been on open ground. Cade guided the cow and calf to a protected spot, then turned his attention back to Clara. We need to wait this out here. Can't risk trying to make it back to the house in this. Could walk right past it and never know. They found a spot against the ravine wall where an overhang provided minimal shelter. Cade pulled Clara down beside him, and they huddled together for warmth while the storm raged around them. Hours passed. Clara lost track of time, lost in the strange suspended reality of the storm. She was cold, exhausted, frightened, but also strangely exhilarated. They'd saved the calf. They'd gotten the herd to safety. They were alive. At some point, she realized she was pressed against Cade's side, his arm around her shoulders, his body heat the only thing keeping the cold at bay. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, could hear him breathing despite the wind. You did well up there, he said quietly, his voice rough. When you fell, I thought... He stopped, swallowed hard. I thought I'd lost you. Clara looked up at him, saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. You were scared. Terrified. He didn't try to hide it. Clara, if something happened to you... But it didn't. Clara's hand found his, their gloved fingers intertwining. I'm right here. They sat like that as the storm slowly diminished, holding on to each other in the freezing darkness. And Clara felt something shift between them, some invisible boundary crossed or perhaps dissolved entirely. By the time the storm finally blew itself out, dawn was breaking gray and cold over the snow-covered landscape. They made their way back to the ranch in silence, both too exhausted for words. But when they reached the house and Cade helped Clara up the porch steps, his hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, he said, for not giving up, for being exactly who you are. Clara wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that she'd never felt more alive than in these months with him, that partnership was becoming something deeper, whether either of them had planned for it or not. But exhaustion won out, and she simply squeezed his hand before heading inside to change out of her frozen clothes. The days following the storm were a blur of recovery and repair. One of the outbuildings had partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Several sections of fence needed replacing, and the cattle required extra feed and attention after their ordeal. But the calf survived, thriving against all odds. Clara took to checking on it multiple times a day, drawn to the little creature that had nearly cost her life. Cade noticed, though he said nothing about it directly. Going to need a name, he mentioned one evening as they watched the calf nurse from its mother. Can't keep calling it the calf forever. Miracle, Clara said immediately, then felt foolish. That's too sentimental, isn't it? No. Cade's tone was thoughtful. It fits. Takes a miracle to survive being born in a blizzard. Another miracle that we got to her in time. They stood together in the barn's warm dimness, and Clara felt Cade's presence beside her with an awareness that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The careful distance they'd maintained since their wedding was eroding, worn away by shared work and shared danger and the simple intimacy of surviving winter together. February brought a brief respite from the constant storms, and with it came visitors. The bishops arrived one clear afternoon, their wagon loaded with supplies and their faces bright with cabin fever. "We couldn't stand it anymore," Margaret announced, jumping down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "If I had to spend one more day talking only to Thomas, I was going to lose my mind. No offense, darling." "None taken," Thomas said amiably. "I was about to suggest we make the trip myself." They spent the afternoon catching up, sharing winter stories over Margaret's excellent stew. Clara found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, the sound strange and wonderful in her own ears. "You look different," Margaret observed when the men had stepped outside to check on some equipment. "Stronger, more settled into yourself somehow." "I feel different," Claire admitted. "Like I'm finally becoming the person I was supposed to be all along." Margaret studied her with knowing eyes. "And how are things between you and Cade? I don't mean to pry, but you're going to anyway?" Clara smiled to take any sting from the words. "Guilty," Margaret grinned. "So? Are you two still playing at this marriage of convenience charade, or has something shifted?" Clara felt heat creep into her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, Clara, I saw the way he looked at you when you came in from the barn earlier, and the way you look at him when you think no one's watching." Margaret leaned forward. "There's nothing wrong with a practical arrangement becoming something more. In fact, those often make the strongest marriages. You build the foundation first, then love grows from respect and partnership." "Who said anything about love?" Clara protested weakly. "You don't have to say it. It's written all over both of you." Margaret's expression turned serious. "But Clara, you have to be willing to reach for it. Some people are so afraid of being hurt that they never let themselves have the thing they want most. Don't be one of those people." Before Clara could respond, the men returned and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But Margaret's words stayed with her long after the bishops had departed. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the house settle around her. Down the hall, she could hear Cade moving around in his room, the familiar sounds of him preparing for bed. 6 months ago, he'd been a stranger. Now he was the person she knew best in the world, the one whose presence she looked for first thing every morning and missed when he was away. Was Margaret right? Had partnership become something more without her noticing? And if it had, what was she supposed to do about it? The questions haunted her through the next week as they worked side by side, as they shared quiet evenings by the fire, as they fell into the rhythms of their life together. Clara found herself hyper-aware of every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of wordless understanding. Then came the morning she woke to find Cade's horse missing from the barn and a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table. Gone to check the northern fence line, back by nightfall. Clara went about her morning chores with mounting unease. The northern fence line was miles away, through difficult terrain, and while the weather had been clear recently, conditions could change quickly. By mid-afternoon, clouds had rolled in, dark and heavy with the promise of snow. Clara stood on the porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of Cade's return. Nothing. Just the endless white landscape and the gathering storm. By dusk, real worry had set in. Cade knew these mountains better than anyone, but accidents happened. Horses could step wrong, throw their riders. A man could get turned around in bad weather, end up walking in circles. Clara paced the house, trying to convince herself she was overreacting. But as full darkness fell and the snow began, her anxiety transformed into something closer to panic. She couldn't just sit here. Wouldn't sit here while Cade might be hurt or lost or worse. She dressed in her warmest clothes, grabbed supplies and a lantern, and headed for the barn. Thunder, Cade's riding horse, was the fastest and most sure-footed. Clara saddled him with hands that shook only slightly, took a deep breath, and mounted up. She'd gotten better at riding over the past months, but she'd never attempted anything like this, riding alone in darkness through a snowstorm to find someone who might not want to be found. But the alternative, waiting while Cade was in danger, was unthinkable. She headed north, following what she hoped was the route Cade would have taken. The snow was light at first, just enough to blur visibility without making travel impossible. Clara kept Thunder moving at a steady pace, calling Cade's name into the darkness every few minutes. An hour passed. Then 2. Clara's fear deepened with every minute of silence. She was about to turn back. The storm was worsening, and she was risking both their lives by continuing when she heard it. A faint response, barely audible over the wind. Clara's heart leaped. "Cade! Here!" The voice was stronger this time, off to her left. Clara urged Thunder forward, following the sound. And then she saw him, a dark shape against the snow, limping but upright, leading his horse. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Cade's voice was rough with what might have been anger or relief or both. "You could have gotten yourself killed." Clara dismounted and ran to him, checking for injuries with shaking hands. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "Horse threw a shoe. By the time I noticed, we were miles from home." Cade winced as Clara's hands found a tender spot on his ribs. "Got bucked off when she stepped wrong. Nothing broken, just bruised. But what were you thinking? Coming out here alone?" "I was thinking you might need help." Clara's voice rose with all the fear she'd been suppressing. "I was thinking I couldn't just sit at home while you were out here hurt or lost. I was thinking that if something happened to you, She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "You what?" Cade asked quietly, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "I couldn't bear it," Clara finished, her voice barely a whisper. "Cade, when you didn't come home, I realized that somewhere along the way, this stopped being a practical arrangement for me. You stopped being just a partner, and the thought of losing you—" She didn't get to finish. Cade pulled her against him, his arms tight around her despite his injured ribs, his face pressed into her hair. "I know," he said roughly. "I know, because when you fell during that storm, when I thought I might lose you, I realized the same thing. This stopped being practical a long time ago." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the falling snow while their horses waited patiently. Then Cade pulled back just enough to look at her face. "We should probably talk about this," he said. "Figure out what it means, where we go from here." "Later," Clara agreed. "Right now, let's just get home." They rode back together through the storm, Clara on Thunder and Cade on his limping mare, their paths lit by the swinging lantern. When they finally reached the ranch, they tended the horses together in comfortable silence, then stumbled into the house half-frozen and exhausted. Cade built up the fire while Clara made coffee, and they sat together on the floor in front of the hearth, shoulders touching, warming themselves against the cold. "So," Cade said eventually, "we seem to have gotten ourselves into something complicated." "Seems that way." Clara sipped her coffee, gathering courage. "The question is, what do we do about it?" "I suppose that depends on what you want." Cade set down his cup and turned to face her fully. "Clara, I never expected this. When I asked you to come here, I genuinely thought we could maintain a simple partnership. But working beside you these past months, watching you become this strong, capable woman who faces every challenge without flinching, somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing a partner and started seeing someone I couldn't imagine my life without." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "I feel the same way. But Cade, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone's wife in the way you might want. I'm still the same awkward girl from Black Hollow." "No, you're not." Cade's voice was firm. "You're Clara Mercer, who saved a calf in a blizzard, who learned to shoot and ride and survived the frontier in less than 6 months, who walked into a storm to find me even though it scared her. And I don't want you to be anyone other than exactly who you are. Even though I'm not beautiful, even though I'm not delicate or graceful or any of the things men usually want, especially because you're none of those things." Cade reached out and took her hand. "Clara, I had beautiful and delicate with Sarah. It was a disaster because she needed things I couldn't give her, things the frontier doesn't allow for. With you, I have something real, something honest, and if you're willing, I'd like to see what that could become." Clara looked at their joined hands, at the calluses they both bore from hard work, at the simple reality of two people who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances. "I'm willing, but I'm also terrified. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not enough?" "You're already more than enough." Cade's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "And we'll figure out the rest as we go. That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it? Taking it day by day, learning as we go?" Clara nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest. "So what happens now?" "Now we acknowledge what's been building between us for months. We stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement. We build something together deliberately, with open eyes and honest hearts." Cade paused. "And maybe, when you're ready, you could consider moving your things into my room. So we're not just partners anymore, but truly husband and wife." Heat flooded Clara's face, but she didn't look away. I'd like that. Not tonight, I don't think I'm ready for tonight, but soon. Whenever you're ready, Cade squeezed her hand gently. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. They sat together in front of the fire until the early hours of morning, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for spring, sharing dreams they'd never voiced aloud. And when they finally went upstairs to their separate rooms, Clara paused in her doorway. Cade? He turned back, silhouetted against the lamplight from his room. Thank you, Clara said, for seeing something in me worth choosing, worth keeping. Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, Cade replied, and for becoming exactly the person I needed, even though neither of us knew it at the time. Clara lay in bed that night with her heart full of a hope so fierce it frightened her. She'd spent her entire life believing she was unworthy of love, convinced that the best she could hope for was to be overlooked rather than actively mocked. But Cade had looked at her and seen strength, had chosen her deliberately, had fallen for her the same way she'd fallen for him, slowly, through shared work and mutual respect, and the gradual recognition of compatibility. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. There had been no lightning bolt, no love at first sight, no dramatic declarations. Instead, it had been something quieter and steadier and somehow more real. They'd built a foundation first, and now love was growing from it, natural as spring growth from winter earth. The next weeks brought a subtle shift in their dynamic. They worked together as always, but now there were touches that lingered, glances that communicated more than words, small gestures of affection that neither had permitted before. Cade would brush snow from Clara's hair after they came in from outside. Clara would automatically pour his coffee the way he liked it without being asked. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of long-married couples, except now they acknowledged the intimacy instead of pretending it wasn't there. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after their conversation by the fire, Clara stood in her room looking at the few belongings she'd accumulated. It wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books, the embroidery Margaret had taught her. Everything she owned could fit in a single trunk. She heard Cade moving around in his room and made a decision. Before she could second-guess herself, she knocked on his door. Come in. Cade was sitting on his bed, reading by lamplight. He looked up when Clara entered, and something shifted in his expression when he saw what she was carrying. I think I'm ready, Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. If the offer still stands. Cade set down his book and stood. It stands. Always will. He helped her move her things, making space in his dresser and closet without any fuss or commentary. When everything was settled, they stood together in the room that was now theirs, and Clara felt the significance of the moment settle over her like a weight. We don't have to, Cade started. I know. Clara reached for his hand. But I want to. I want to be your wife in every sense. I'm just nervous because I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm afraid I'll be awkward or disappointing. Cade silenced her with a kiss, gentle and unhurried. When he pulled back, his expression was tender. You could never disappoint me, and we'll figure this out together, just like we've figured out everything else. What followed was tender and fumbling and utterly unlike anything Clara had imagined in her most secret thoughts. Cade was patient, attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. And when it was over and they lay together in the darkness, Clara felt something fundamental settle into place. Are you all right? Cade asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders. Better than all right. Clara nestled closer. I never thought I could have this. Any of this. I thought I was destined to be alone, or at best tolerated. But with you, I'm loved, Cade finished. You're loved, Clara, completely and honestly. I should have said it before now, but I love you, not for what you do or how useful you are, but for who you are. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. I love you too. I think I have for a while now, but I was too afraid to admit it. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Clara woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the window and Cade's steady breathing beside her. For a moment she simply lay there, marveling at the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago she'd been the town joke, believing herself unworthy of love or respect. Now she was Clara Mercer, wife to a good man, partner in a thriving ranch, capable of things she'd never imagined. And most miraculous of all, she was loved for exactly who she was, without having to change or diminish herself to earn that love. The sound of horses approaching broke through her reverie. Cade woke instantly, alert to potential danger, but relaxed when he recognized the riders. "The bishops," he said, already moving to dress. "Wonder what brings them out this early." They hurried to make themselves presentable and met Thomas and Margaret on the porch. Margaret's face was bright with barely suppressed excitement. "We have news," she announced without preamble. "Black Hollow is having their spring social next month, first one since before the war. And Thomas and I think you two should go." Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. "Why would we do that?" "Because people need to see you two together," Margaret said firmly. "See that you're genuinely happy, that your marriage is real and strong. The gossip about you has been vicious, Clara. They're saying Cade keeps you isolated out here because he's ashamed of you, that you're basically a servant with a wedding ring." "Let them talk," Cade said dismissively. "Their opinions don't matter." "They do, though." Margaret's tone turned serious. "Because that kind of talk can be damaging. It can poison relationships and opportunities. And more importantly, Clara deserves better than to have her character assassinated by people who don't know her." Clara looked at Cade, saw her own reluctance mirrored in his face. But underneath that, she felt something else stirring. Margaret was right. She'd spent her entire life hiding from mockery, making herself small to avoid attention. But she wasn't that person anymore. She was Clara Mercer, and maybe it was time to show Black Hollow exactly who that was. "We'll go," Clara said, surprising herself with the decision. "We'll show them." Cade's eyebrows rose. "Are you sure?" "No," Clara admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The weeks leading up to the spring social passed in a strange blur of anticipation and dread. Clara threw herself into ranch work with even more intensity than usual, as if physical exhaustion could quiet the nervous energy building inside her. But at night, lying beside Cade in the darkness, the worries would surface. "What if this is a mistake?" she whispered one evening, her voice barely audible. "What if going back there just gives them fresh ammunition?" Cade pulled her closer, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Then we leave. We don't owe them anything, Clara. Not our time, not our dignity, and certainly not our presence. We're going because you decided you wanted to, but that decision isn't permanent. If it becomes too much, we walk out." "Just like that?" "Just like that." His voice was firm. "You're not the same person who left Black Hollow 7 months ago. You don't have to accept their treatment anymore. And I'll be damned if I let anyone make you feel small again." The conviction in his words settled something in Clara's chest. She'd spent so long being afraid of judgment that she'd forgotten she had the power to simply refuse it. Black Hollow's opinion only mattered if she let it matter. Margaret arrived 3 days before the social with a dress draped over her arm and determination written across her face. "Absolutely not," she announced, marching into the house without invitation. "You are not wearing one of your work dresses to this event. I won't allow it." Clara looked at the garment Margaret was holding, a deep green fabric that caught the light beautifully, simple in design but clearly well made. "Margaret, I can't accept—" "It's not charity, it's strategy." Margaret laid the dress across the back of a chair. "Those people expect you to show up looking downtrodden and subservient, proof that Cade married beneath himself. Instead, you're going to walk in looking exactly like what you are, a woman who's thriving, who's strong and capable and happy. Trust me on this." Clara ran her fingers over the fabric, soft and finer than anything she'd ever owned. "What if it doesn't fit?" "Then we'll make it fit. I'm handy with a needle." Margaret's expression softened. "Clara, let me do this for you. Please. You've become one of my dearest friends, and I want to see you walk into that town square with your head held high." They spent the afternoon adjusting the dress, Margaret's skilled hands taking in seams and letting out others until the garment fit Clara's frame perfectly. When Clara finally stood before the mirror in the finished product, she barely recognized herself. The dress emphasized her height and broad shoulders instead of trying to hide them. The deep green brought out the color of her eyes and complemented her dark hair. She looked strong, substantial, real, not delicate or conventionally pretty, but undeniably striking. "That's the woman who saved a calf in a blizzard," Margaret said softly, standing behind Clara and meeting her eyes in the mirror. "That's the woman who rode into a storm to find her husband. That's who they're going to see." Cade appeared in the doorway, stopped short, and just stared. Clara felt heat creep into her cheeks under his scrutiny. "Well," she asked, suddenly uncertain. Is it too much? No. Cade's voice was rough. It's perfect. You're perfect. Margaret beamed. My work here is done. Now I just need to make sure Thomas hasn't forgotten how to dance, and we'll all be ready. After Margaret left, Clara changed back into her work clothes, but she kept glancing at the dress hanging in the corner of their room. It represented something more than just fabric and thread. It was armor, a declaration, a refusal to be diminished. The morning of the social dawned clear and warm, one of those perfect spring days that felt like a gift after the brutal winter. Clara woke early, her stomach already churning with nerves. Cade was already up, standing at the window and watching the sunrise. Second thoughts? He asked without turning around. About 100 of them. Clara joined him at the window, and he wrapped an arm around her waist. But I'm still going. That's my girl. They completed their morning chores in companionable silence, then began the process of preparing for town. Clara bathed in the washroom, scrubbing away months of accumulated frontier grit, then carefully arranged her hair in the simple but elegant style Margaret had taught her. When she finally put on the green dress, her hands were shaking. Cade knocked softly before entering. He'd cleaned up too, trading his usual work clothes for a dark suit Clara had only seen once before, at their wedding. He looked handsome and slightly dangerous, his scar a reminder that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. Ready? He asked. No, but let's go anyway. They rode together on Thunder, Clara seated in front of Cade with his arms bracketing her as he held the reins. The bishops met them halfway to Black Hollow, and Margaret let out a delighted exclamation when she saw Clara. Perfect! Oh, you look absolutely perfect! The four of them rode into Black Hollow together, just as the sun reached its zenith. The town square had been decorated for the occasion. Bunting hung between buildings, tables laden with food lined one side of the square, and a small wooden platform had been erected for dancing. People were already gathering, dressed in their finest, voices rising in laughter and conversation. The chatter died the moment Clara and Cade appeared. Clara felt every eye in the square fix on her, felt the weight of judgment and speculation and undisguised curiosity. Her instinct was to dismount quickly, to find a corner where she could hide. But Cade's presence at her back steadied her, and she forced herself to sit tall, to meet those stares without flinching. Cade dismounted first, then reached up to help Clara down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, a deliberate display of affection that wasn't lost on the watching crowd. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm. Clara took it, and they walked into the square together. Sheriff Morrison was the first to approach, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, Cade replied evenly. Beautiful day for a celebration. Others began to drift over, some genuinely friendly, offering congratulations on the marriage and asking polite questions about the ranch. Others were clearly fishing for gossip, their questions pointed and loaded with implication. Must be lonely out there, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. So isolated, with just the two of you for company. We manage, Claire replied, keeping her voice light. Though we've had visitors, the bishops have been wonderful neighbors. The bishops are quality people, Mrs. Henderson agreed, the implication clear, unlike some present company. Bethany Morrison appeared with her new husband, a thin young man who looked vaguely uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. Bethany had gained weight since Clara last saw her, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion. Clara! Bethany's greeting was bright and false. Look at you. That dress is lovely. Very substantial. Thank you. Clara refused to take the bait. You look well too, Bethany. Married life seems to suit you. Oh, it's wonderful, Bethany gushed, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. James is so attentive. We're expecting our first child in the fall. Clara noticed how Bethany's hand moved protectively to her still flat stomach, how her husband's expression tightened slightly at the announcement made so publicly. She felt a flash of unexpected pity. Congratulations, Clara said sincerely. That's wonderful news. Bethany seemed taken aback by the genuine warmth in Clara's response. She opened her mouth, closed it, then managed a quieter, "Thank you." The afternoon wore on, and Clara found herself relaxing incrementally. The whispers continued, but they were losing their power. She was answering questions confidently, describing life on the ranch with genuine enthusiasm, and most importantly, she was standing beside Cade not as a burden or an embarrassment, but as an equal partner. Then her mother appeared. Louisa Whitmore looked older than when Clara had seen her last, her face drawn and her dress shabby, despite obvious attempts to make it presentable. She approached slowly, and Clara felt Cade tense beside her. "Clara," Louisa said, her voice lacking its usual venom. "You look different." "I am different," Clara replied carefully. "Life on the frontier changes a person." Louisa's eyes flicked to Cade, then back to Clara. Are you happy?" The question was so unexpected that Clara didn't know how to respond at first. She studied her mother's face, looking for the trap, the cruel twist that would inevitably follow. But Louisa just looked tired and sad and somehow smaller than she used to be. "Yes," Clara said finally, "I'm happier than I've ever been." Something flickered across Louisa's face, regret, perhaps, or loss. "I'm glad. You deserve that, I suppose." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the nearest thing to kindness Louisa had ever offered, and Clara found herself nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying so." Louisa drifted away, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Cade squeezed her hand gently. "You handled that well." "I handled it honestly," Clara corrected. "That's all I know how to do anymore." As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, someone called for the dancing to begin. A fiddle player climbed onto the platform, joined by a man with a guitar and another with a harmonica. They struck up a lively tune, and couples began moving toward the dancing area. Clara felt panic rise in her throat. Dancing. She'd managed to forget about the dancing. "We don't have to," Cade murmured, reading her anxiety. But Clara remembered Margaret's words, remembered the vision she'd had of walking into this town square and refusing to be diminished, and she made a decision that surprised even herself. "Yes, we do." She stepped away from Cade, walked to the center of the square where everyone could see her, and turned to face the crowd. The music faltered, conversations died. Every eye in Black Hollow fixed on Clara Mercer standing alone in the middle of the dancing area. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high and her voice steady. "I know what you all think of me, what you've always thought of me. The town joke, the girl nobody wanted, the woman who somehow tricked a good man into marriage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I'm not that person anymore. Maybe I never was, really. That was just the role you assigned me, and I was too afraid to refuse it." She looked directly at Bethany, at Mrs. Henderson, at all the people who'd made her childhood and adolescence miserable. "I'm Clara Mercer. I run a successful ranch with my husband. I can ride a horse through a blizzard, shoot a rifle accurately at 50 yards, and survive a frontier winter that would break most of you. I've worked harder in the past 7 months than most of you will work in your entire lives, and I've discovered that I'm stronger than anyone, including myself, ever imagined." The square was absolutely silent now. Clara turned to find Cade in the crowd, found him watching her with an expression of fierce pride and something deeper that made her heart swell. "But most importantly," Clara continued, her voice softening slightly, "I've learned what it means to be valued. Not for what I look like or how delicate I am, but for who I actually am. My husband chose me not because he felt sorry for me, but because he saw strength where everyone else saw weakness. And he was right." She extended her hand toward Cade. "So yes, I'm going to dance. With my husband, in front of all of you, because I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. And I'm certainly not ashamed of my marriage." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Cade crossed the distance between them in long strides, took Clara's outstretched hand, and pulled her into his arms. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing you've ever done," he murmured against her ear. "Maybe both," Clara whispered back, her voice shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "I can't believe I just did that." "I can. You're magnificent." The musicians, after a moment of stunned silence, began to play again, this time a slower, more elegant waltz. Cade led Clara into the dance, and she followed his lead with a grace she'd never known she possessed. They'd practiced this on quiet evenings at the ranch. Cade had taught her the basic steps, moving furniture aside to create space in their main room. But this was different. This was public, visible, a declaration witnessed by everyone who'd ever doubted them. Clara stumbled once, her foot catching on Cade's, but he steadied her without missing a beat. And she realized something profound. She wasn't afraid of making mistakes anymore. Wasn't afraid of being seen as clumsy or awkward, because the only person whose opinion truly mattered was currently holding her close and looking at her like she was the most remarkable woman in the world. They danced in silence for several measures, moving together with the unconscious coordination they'd developed through months of shared work. And gradually, Clara became aware of the crowd's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. Nobody was laughing, nobody was whispering behind their hands or exchanging knowing smirks. They were just watching, some with expressions of surprise, others with something that looked almost like respect. "They're not laughing," Clara breathed. "No," Kate agreed. "They're not." The song ended, and in the brief silence before the next one began, someone started clapping. Then another person joined in, and another, until a smattering of applause rippled through the crowd. It wasn't universal. Clara could see Bethany's husband standing with his arms crossed, and Mrs. Henderson's expression remained pinched, but it was more than she'd ever expected. The bishops joined them on the dancing area, Margaret beaming like a proud mother. Other couples followed, and soon the square was filled with moving figures, the earlier tension dissolving into something approaching normalcy. But Clara knew the real moment had passed. She'd stood in front of the town that had tormented her and refused to be small, had claimed her strength publicly and dared them to challenge it. And whether they accepted her or not, she'd finally accepted herself. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself actually enjoying the social. She danced with Thomas Bishop, while Cade danced with Margaret. She made small talk with women who'd once shunned her and found that some of them were genuinely interested in hearing about ranch life. She even shared a laugh with one of her former tormentors over a story about a stubborn cow. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when a young woman Clara vaguely recognized approached her. She was maybe 18, with nervous eyes and a tentative smile. "Mrs. Mercer, I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all." Clara tried to place the girl's face. "Have we met?" "Sort of. I'm Emma Dalton. I used to see you at the general store sometimes." The girl twisted her hands together. "I just wanted to say, what you said earlier about being stronger than people think, that meant something to me. My pa wants me to marry Mr. Gunderson. He's 53 and already buried 2 wives. And everyone says I should be grateful for the match, because I'm too tall and too plain to do better. But watching you tonight, seeing how you and Mr. Mercer are together, it made me think maybe I don't have to settle. Maybe there's someone out there who'd value me for who I am." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You don't have to settle, Emma. You deserve to be chosen by someone who sees your worth, not just your utility. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Even if it means defying my father, even if it means the whole town thinks I'm foolish." Clara thought about her own journey, leaving Black Hollow, learning to survive the frontier, discovering her own strength. Especially then, the town's opinion doesn't keep you warm at night or make you feel valued or help you become who you're meant to be. Only you can decide what kind of life you want, Emma. But I can tell you this, being chosen by the right person for the right reasons is worth whatever judgment comes with it. Emma's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. Thank you for showing us it's possible." After the girl left, Clara stood alone for a moment, processing what had just happened. She'd become something she never imagined, an example, a proof of possibility. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. Cade found her there, 2 cups of punch in his hands. "You all right? You look shaken. That girl, Emma Dalton, she said I inspired her." Clara accepted the punch gratefully. "Cade, I'm not inspirational. I'm just trying to survive." "You're doing more than surviving. You're thriving and showing other people that it's possible to choose a different path." He touched her cheek gently. "That's powerful, Clara, whether you intended it or not." As full darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting everything in warm, golden light. The dancing continued, but the energy was mellower now, people tired from the day's festivities but reluctant to let it end. Sheriff Morrison approached Cade, his expression serious. "Mr. Mercer, could I have a word?" Clara tensed, but Cade squeezed her hand reassuringly before stepping aside with the sheriff. She watched them talk, trying to read their body language. Whatever Morrison was saying, Cade's responses were brief and his posture guarded. When they finished, Cade returned to Clara's side with an unreadable expression. "What did he want?" Clara asked. "To apologize, apparently." Cade's tone was dry. "Said he'd misjudged our situation, that seeing us together made it clear our marriage was genuine. Also mentioned that several of the young women in town have been asking their mothers why they can't have marriages like ours, partnerships instead of transactions. The mothers are not pleased." Clara couldn't help but laugh. "We're corrupting the youth of Black Hollow." "Apparently so." Cade's expression softened. "Ready to head home? We've made our statement. No need to linger." "More than ready." They said their goodbyes to the bishops, promised to visit soon, and retrieved Thunder from where he'd been tethered. As they rode out of Black Hollow, Clara looked back one last time at the town square with its lanterns and lingering dancers. It looked smaller somehow, less significant, like it had lost its power to define her. "No regrets?" Cade asked as they left the town behind. Clara settled back against him, feeling his solid warmth at her back. "Not a single one." "You?" "None whatsoever." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm proud of you, Clara. What you did tonight, standing up like that, claiming your strength publicly, that took more courage than most people ever have to summon. I had to. For Emma, for other girls like her who think they have to accept whatever scraps they're offered." Clara paused. "And for myself, I suppose. I needed to prove that I wasn't that frightened girl anymore." "You proved it. To everyone, but most importantly, to yourself." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the social fading behind them until there was nothing but the night sounds of the frontier, wind in the grass, the distant call of an owl, Thunder's steady hoofbeats. "Do you think anything will change?" Clara asked eventually. "In Black Hollow, I mean. Will they treat women differently because of what they saw tonight?" "Maybe. Maybe not." Cade's tone was philosophical. "But you've planted a seed, Clara. Shown them a different possibility. What grows from that is up to them, but you've done your part." Clara thought about Emma Dalton's shining eyes, about the way even some of her former tormentors had seemed thoughtful rather than dismissive. Maybe Cade was right. Maybe change didn't happen all at once, but in small moments of courage that inspired others to find their own strength. The ranch appeared in the distance, dark against the starlit sky. Home. Clara felt the words settle into her bones with a rightness that still amazed her. This isolated, demanding place had become her sanctuary, the space where she could be fully herself without apology or shame. They tended to Thunder together, then walked hand in hand to the house. Inside, Clara carefully removed the green dress and hung it in their closet, running her fingers over the fabric one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Cade was already changing into more comfortable clothes. "For choosing me. For seeing something worth valuing when everyone else saw a joke. For giving me the space to become who I was meant to be." Cade crossed to her, still barefoot and half-dressed, and pulled her into his arms. "You don't need to thank me for that. Choosing you was the smartest decision I've ever made. You saved me as much as I saved you, Clara. Maybe more." "How did I save you?" "By reminding me that life could be more than just survival. By bringing warmth back into this house. By being brave enough to fall in love with a scarred widower who didn't know how to open his heart again." He rested his forehead against hers. "You brought me back to life, Clara Mercer, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret taking that chance." Clara kissed him then, long and deep, pouring everything she felt but couldn't always articulate into the touch. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "Take me to bed," Clara whispered. "Our bed. In our home. And remind me that this is real." Cade did exactly that, and as they came together in the darkness, Clara marveled at how far she'd traveled from that morning in Black Hollow when she'd stood under the oak tree believing herself unworthy of love. She'd crossed physical distance, certainly, but the internal journey had been infinitely longer. She traveled from self-hatred to self-acceptance, from fear to courage, from isolation to partnership, and most miraculously, from believing herself unlovable to resting secure in the knowledge that she was cherished exactly as she was. Later, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath, Cade traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future," Clara admitted. "What comes next for us?" "What do you want to come next?" Clara considered the question seriously. I want to expand the ranch, maybe get some sheep to go with the cattle. I want to help Margaret teach other frontier women the skills they need to thrive. I want to visit Emma Dalton and make sure she doesn't let herself be bullied into a marriage she doesn't want. She paused. And eventually, maybe, I'd like to have children. Teach them that strength comes in different forms and that kindness matters more than appearance. Cade was quiet for a moment, and Clara wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much hope for a future he might not want to share. Then he said, I'd like all of that too, especially the children part. I think you'd be an extraordinary mother. You do? I know you would. You're patient, strong, kind, and you understand what it's like to be underestimated. Any child of ours would be lucky to have you. He pulled her closer. Though fair warning, if we have a daughter who looks like you and has your spirit, I'm going to spend her entire childhood terrifying any man who comes calling. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. And if we have a son who looks like you and has your stubbornness, then we'll both have our hands full. Cade kissed her temple. But we'll figure it out together, just like we figured out everything else. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Clara's last conscious thought was that she'd found something she'd never even known to look for. Not just love, but true partnership. A meeting of equals who made each other better, stronger, more complete. The spring social became something of a legend in Black Hollow and the surrounding territories. People who'd been there told and retold the story of Clara Mercer standing in the town square and claiming her worth, of the dance that had silenced the gossips, of the transformation of the town's former outcast into a woman who commanded respect. But Clara herself thought about it less and less as the weeks turned into months. She had work to do, a life to build, a partnership to nurture. Black Hollow's opinion, once so devastating and all-consuming, had become irrelevant to her daily existence. What mattered was the ranch thriving under their joint care. What mattered was the way Cade looked at her each morning like she was his greatest treasure. What mattered was Emma Dalton riding out to visit, having successfully refused the match with Mr. Gunderson and finding work as a teacher in a neighboring town. What mattered was Margaret's friendship and the growing network of frontier women who supported each other through the isolation and challenges of this demanding life. Clara had set out to prove something that day in the town square, that she was more than Black Hollow's judgment, that she possessed strength and value they'd never recognized. But in the end, the only person she'd really needed to convince was herself, and she had, completely and irrevocably. Clara Mercer knew her own worth now, carried it like an internal fire that no amount of external darkness could extinguish. She'd found her strength, claimed her space, and built a life that was honest and real and entirely her own. That, more than any public declaration or silenced gossip, was her true victory. Summer arrived with a vengeance, transforming the valley into a sea of golden grass that rippled in the constant wind. Clara stood on the porch in the early morning light, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, watching Cade work with the new horses they'd acquired from a traveling trader. 4 months pregnant, and she still marveled at the miracle of it. She'd never imagined herself as a mother, had never dared to hope for that particular future, but here she was, carrying Cade's child, feeling the flutter of movement that the midwife had assured her was perfectly normal. "You're supposed to be resting," Cade called out, catching sight of her. "I'm standing. That counts as resting." Clara smiled as he approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Besides, the baby and I wanted to watch you work." Cade placed his hand over hers on her belly, his expression softening in the way it always did when he thought about their growing family. "How are you feeling?" "Good. Strong." Clara covered his hand with her free one. "The sickness has finally passed, thank heaven. I can actually enjoy food again." Margaret said that's normal for the second trimester. Cade had been reading every piece of literature he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, determined not to be caught unprepared. "But you need to take it easier, Clara. No more climbing into the loft or hauling water. I'm pregnant, not broken." But Clara's tone was gentle, understanding the fear beneath his protectiveness. "I promise to be careful, but I also need to keep working. Sitting idle will drive me mad." They'd had this conversation multiple times over the past months, finding a balance between Cade's worry and Clara's need to remain active and useful. The compromise they'd reached involved Clara doing lighter tasks while Cade hired temporary help for the heavier work. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment. Clara shaded her eyes against the sun and saw 3 riders cresting the hill, the bishops and someone else, a young woman on a gray mare. "That's Emma Dalton," Clara said with surprise and pleasure. "I wonder what brings her all the way out here." As the riders drew closer, Clara could see Emma's face was drawn with worry. The young woman dismounted almost before her horse had fully stopped, rushing toward Clara with urgent energy. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, but I need your help. We need your help." Clara guided Emma to the porch chairs while Margaret and Thomas greeted Cade. "What's happened?" "It's the women in Black Hollow." Emma's words tumbled out in a rush. "After the spring social, after they saw you and Mr. Mercer together, some of them started questioning their own situations, asking why their marriages couldn't be partnerships too, why they had to accept being treated as property or servants." "That's good, isn't it?" Clara asked cautiously. "It would be, except the men are pushing back. Hard." Emma's hands twisted in her lap. Sheriff Morrison convinced the town council to pass new ordinances. Women can't own property independently, can't work outside the home without their husband's permission, can't even gather in groups larger than 3 without male supervision. They're calling it preserving traditional values, but really they're just scared of losing control. Clara felt anger kindle in her chest. They're punishing the women for wanting better treatment. Exactly. Emma leaned forward. And it gets worse. My friend Sarah, you remember her from the social, Sarah Brennan, who was chosen by one of the other men that day? She tried to leave her husband after he hit her for questioning his spending. But Sheriff Morrison sent her right back, said a woman's place is with her husband no matter what. She's terrified, Mrs. Mercer, and she's not the only one. Cade had joined them on the porch, his expression darkening as he listened to Emma's account. This is Morrison's doing. He's always been threatened by anything that challenges his authority. What can we do? Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. We need you to come back to Black Hollow, Emma said, desperately. Not for a social, but to speak to the women directly. Help them understand they have options, that they don't have to accept this. You're living proof that there's another way. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her belly. The thought of returning to Black Hollow while pregnant, of making herself vulnerable to their judgment again, sent ice through her veins. Emma, Margaret said gently, what you're asking is dangerous. If the men are already pushing back this hard, having Clara return might make things worse. Or it might give the women the courage they need to stand together. Emma's voice was fierce. Please, Mrs. Mercer, these women are desperate, and some of them are in real danger. Clara looked at Cade, saw her own conflict reflected in his face. They'd built a good life here, safe and isolated from Black Hollow's politics. Going back meant risking that safety, especially now with the baby coming. But she also remembered being that desperate woman, trapped in a life that offered no escape, believing herself powerless to change her circumstances. I need to think about it, Clara said finally. This isn't a decision I can make lightly. Emma nodded, disappointment clear on her face, but understanding too. Of course. I'm staying at the boarding house in town for the next week if you decide to help. After Emma left with the bishops, Clara and Cade sat together on the porch in heavy silence. You want to go? Cade said eventually. It wasn't a question. I want to help, Clara corrected, but I'm also terrified. What if something happens? What if the men get violent? What if I put our baby at risk? Those are all valid concerns. Cade took her hand. But I also know you, Clara. You won't be able to live with yourself if you don't at least try, and neither will I. Clara looked at him in surprise. You think we should do this? I think we should be smart about it. Not rush in blindly, but plan carefully. His expression was serious. If we're going to help these women, we need to do it right. Legal channels if possible, but also practical support. Safe places for them to go, resources they can access, evidence that can't be dismissed. You've been thinking about this. Since the spring social, honestly, I saw the way some of those women looked at you, Clara, like you'd lit a candle in a dark room. I knew then that what we'd started couldn't be contained to just us. Over the next days, they formed a plan. Cade would reach out to his network of frontier ranchers and businessmen, gathering information about Black Hollow's new ordinances and whether they had any legal standing. Clara would write to Margaret, asking her to quietly gauge which women might be receptive to organizing and which were too frightened or loyal to their husbands. They also made contingency plans, safe routes out of town, allies who could provide shelter, ways to protect themselves if things turned violent. This feels like preparing for war, Clara said one evening as they reviewed their plans. In a way it is, Cade replied grimly. Morrison and his cronies won't give up their power willingly. We need to be ready for resistance. A week later, they received responses. Margaret's letter detailed a network of nearly 20 women who were desperate for change but terrified to act alone. Cade's contacts confirmed that Black Hollow's ordinances were legally questionable at best, likely unenforceable if challenged properly. We have leverage, Cade said, studying the letters. The territorial governor has been trying to modernize frontier settlements, bring them in line with federal standards. These ordinances violate several territorial laws. But knowing they're illegal and getting them overturned are two different things, Clara pointed out. True, which is why we need to approach this strategically. Cade spread out a rough map of Black Hollow. We go in openly. Make no secret of our intentions. I'll meet with the town council formally, present the legal issues with their ordinances. You meet with the women, help them understand their rights and options. And when Morrison refuses to back down, then we escalate. Bring in the territorial authorities, make this bigger than just one small town's politics. Cade's expression was determined. But we give them the chance to do the right thing first. They set out for Black Hollow on a crisp autumn morning, the air sharp with the promise of coming winter. Clara rode beside Cade this time, rather than behind him, both of them needing the independence of their own mounts for what was coming. As they approached the town, Clara felt the familiar clench of anxiety, but also something new. A steely resolve born from knowing her own worth and fighting for others who hadn't yet discovered theirs. Emma met them at the edge of town, her face lighting up with relief. You came. I wasn't sure you would. Where are the women gathering? Clara asked. The church basement. It's the only place Morrison's ordinance doesn't apply. He can't restrict religious gatherings without losing support from the congregation. Clever, Cade approved. What about the men? Most are at the saloon or working, but Sheriff Morrison knows you're coming. He sent word that he wants to meet with you at his office. Cade and Clara exchanged glances. Together, Clara said. We face this together. Sheriff Morrison's office was exactly as Clara remembered, cramped and dim, smelling of tobacco and old leather. Morrison himself sat behind his desk, looking older and more tired than she'd seen him at the spring social. Two other council members flanked him, their expressions hostile. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. Morrison's greeting was cool. I understand you have concerns about our town's governance. I have concerns about ordinances that violate territorial law and basic human rights, Cade replied evenly, pulling out the documents his contacts had provided. These regulations limiting women's property rights, freedom of movement, and association are illegal under territorial statute. They need to be rescinded. Morrison barely glanced at the papers. Black Hollow governs itself according to its own values. What happens in the territorial capital doesn't concern us. It does when federal marshals get involved, Cade countered, and they will if these ordinances stand. Is that really what you want? Outside intervention in your town's affairs? One of the council members, a florid man named Hutchins, leaned forward. This is your wife's doing. She came here stirring up trouble with her talk of partnerships and equality, turned our women against their natural roles. My wife spoke the truth about her own marriage, Cade interrupted, his voice cold. If that truth threatened your authority, perhaps you should examine why your authority is so fragile. How dare you? Hutchins started to rise, but Morrison held up a hand. Enough. The sheriff studied Cade with calculating eyes. What exactly do you want, Mercer? Rescind the ordinances, allow women the same basic rights as men under territorial law, and stop punishing them for wanting to be treated with dignity and respect. And if we refuse? Then I contact the territorial governor's office, file formal complaints, and bring in authorities who will force compliance. Cade's tone was matter-of-fact. I'd rather resolve this locally, but I will escalate if necessary. Morrison was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, I'll bring it to the full council, but I can't promise anything. The men in this town have strong feelings about maintaining proper order. Then maybe it's time they learned that proper order includes justice, Clara said quietly. She'd remained silent until now, but something in Morrison's dismissive attitude sparked her anger. These ordinances aren't about order, Sheriff. They're about control, about keeping women dependent and afraid because that's easier than treating them as equals. Mrs. Mercer, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Clara's voice was steady but fierce. I understand that you're threatened by women who question their circumstances. I understand that men like you need others to feel small so you can feel big. And I understand that no amount of legal maneuvering will change the fundamental problem. You don't see women as fully human. The office went deathly quiet. Hutchins' face had gone purple with rage, but Morrison just stared at Clara with an unreadable expression. I think this meeting is over, the sheriff said finally. We'll consider your suggestions. In the meantime, I'd suggest you both leave town before dark, for your own safety. The threat was barely veiled. Cade stood slowly, his hand moving to Clara's elbow. We'll be at the boarding house if the council wishes to discuss this reasonably. We leave tomorrow at noon, with or without a resolution. They walked out of the office into bright afternoon sunlight, both of them tense with the awareness that they'd just drawn a line in the sand. That went about as well as expected, Cade muttered. Worse, I think. Clara glanced around the street, noting how people quickly looked away when they saw her. They're not going to back down, Cade. Morrison would rather see this town burn than admit he's wrong. Then we go to Plan B. But first, you have a meeting to attend. The church basement was packed with women. Clara counted at least 30, ranging in age from teenage girls to elderly widows. They fell silent when she entered, every eye fixed on her with a mixture of hope and desperation. Emma stood at the front of the room. Everyone, this is Clara Mercer. I think most of you know her story. Clara walked to the front on shaking legs, acutely aware of her pregnant belly, her plain dress, her complete lack of qualifications for this moment. But she thought of that terrified girl under the oak tree, of the woman who'd walked into a blizzard to save a calf, of the person she'd become through courage and choice. I'm not here to tell you what to do, Clara began. I'm not some kind of hero or leader. I'm just a woman who got lucky enough to escape a situation that was slowly killing her spirit. But I want you to know you have options, you have worth, and you don't have to accept lives that diminish you. Easy for you to say, a woman in the back called out. You got chosen by a good man. Some of us aren't so lucky. You're right, Clara acknowledged. I was lucky, but I also made a choice. I chose to leave everything familiar because staying meant accepting a life of mockery and misery. That choice terrified me, but it saved me. And you can make choices too. Not anymore, another woman said bitterly. Not with these new laws. We can't own anything, can't work, can't even gather like this without risking our husband's wrath. Those laws are illegal, Clara said firmly. My husband is working to get them overturned. But in the meantime, you need to understand something. Your husbands only have the power you give them. Together, you're stronger than they are. Together, you can demand change. You're talking about rebellion, an older woman said, her voice shaking. They'll punish us, beat us. Maybe worse. Maybe they will, Clara admitted. I won't lie to you and say standing up is safe, but neither is staying silent. How many of you have already been hit for questioning, for wanting something better, for simply existing as more than servants? Hands rose slowly throughout the room, not all, but enough to make Clara's heart ache. So much pain, so much suffering, all hidden behind closed doors and proper facades. Here's what I can offer you, Claire continued. The Mercer Ranch can shelter women who need to leave dangerous situations. We're not the only ranch willing to help. I've already spoken with other frontier families who will provide safe haven. If you need to escape, you have places to go. But we can't just abandon our homes, our children, someone protested. No, you can't, and you shouldn't have to. Clara's voice gentled. The goal isn't to destroy families or abandon homes. The goal is to create a situation where women are treated as partners, not property. Where marriages are built on respect instead of control. Some of you might have husbands who can learn to change, who just need to understand that there's another way. Others, she paused, others might be in situations that are irredeemable. Only you can know which is which. For the next 2 hours, Clara answered questions, shared her story in more detail, and helped the women understand their legal rights under territorial law. Emma took notes, compiling a list of specific grievances and incidents that could be used as evidence if they needed to escalate to territorial authorities. By the time the meeting ended, Clara was exhausted but hopeful. The women hadn't committed to any specific action yet, but seeds had been planted. They knew they had options now, had places to go if things became unbearable. Claire was helping Emma clean up when a young woman approached. Sarah Brennan, the one Emma had mentioned who'd tried to leave her husband. "Mrs. Mercer?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Can I talk to you privately?" They stepped into a side room and Sarah pushed up her sleeves to reveal bruises in various stages of healing, dark purple to sickly yellow. "My husband did this because I asked him to stop drinking away our money," Sarah said flatly. "When I tried to leave, Sheriff Morrison dragged me back and told me a wife's duty is to endure. But I can't anymore, Mrs. Mercer. If I stay, he's going to kill me eventually. I can feel it." Clara felt fury and heartbreak war in her chest. "Do you have children?" "A daughter, 3 years old. She watched him hit me last time. I saw something die in her eyes, Mrs. Mercer. I can't let her grow up thinking this is normal." "It's not normal, and you're right to want better." Clara took Sarah's hands carefully, avoiding the bruises. "Pack a bag tonight. Just essentials. Clothes, documents, anything you can't replace. Tomorrow morning, when your husband goes to work, you take your daughter and ride for the Mercer Ranch. Can you do that?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He'll come after me," she moaned. "Let him try. My husband won't let him take you. And if he gets violent, we'll have witnesses and grounds to involve territorial law enforcement." Clara squeezed Sarah's hands gently. "You deserve to be safe, Sarah. Your daughter deserves to grow up without fear. Please, let us help you." After a long moment, Sarah nodded. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be there." Clara and Cade spent that night at the boarding house, both of them restless and alert to potential danger. True to Morrison's thinly veiled threat, they heard drunken men shouting outside around midnight, voices raised in anger about uppity women and outsiders stirring trouble. "We should leave tonight," Cade said quietly, "before this gets worse." "Sarah Brennan is coming to the ranch tomorrow morning," Clara replied. "If we're not there when she arrives, she might lose her nerve. We have to stay." Cade was silent, then nodded. "Then we leave at first light. Be at the ranch before her husband realizes she's gone." They rode out of Black Hollow just as dawn was breaking, pushing their horses faster than was strictly safe. When they finally saw the ranch in the distance, Clara felt relief wash through her. But the relief was short-lived. As they approached the house, they saw smoke rising from one of the outbuildings. "Fire!" Cade shouted, already spurring his horse forward. They raced to the barn, finding one of the storage sheds ablaze. Cade immediately began organizing their efforts, Clara pumping water while he threw buckets on the flames, both of them working frantically to keep the fire from spreading to the main barn where the animals were kept. It took an hour of exhausting work, but they managed to contain the blaze. When it was finally out, Cade examined the shed's remains grimly. "This wasn't an accident. Look, the door was barred from the outside. And there's lamp oil residue." Clara felt ice in her veins. Someone set this deliberately. As a warning, Cade's jaw was tight with anger. Morrison or one of his men, showing us what happens to people who interfere. They were still surveying the damage when Clara heard hoofbeats approaching. She tensed, expecting more trouble, but relaxed slightly when she saw it was just a single rider, a woman on a plodding mare with a small child seated in front of her. Sarah Brennan had come. Clara rushed to help her dismount, noting the haunted look in Sarah's eyes and the way her daughter clung to her with desperate fingers. "You made it," Clara said warmly. "You're safe now." Sarah's face crumpled. "He's going to come after me, after us. He said he'd kill me before he'd let me leave." "Then we'll make sure you're protected." Cade had joined them, his expression gentle despite the circumstances. "Mrs. Brennan, you and your daughter are welcome here for as long as you need. And if your husband shows up making threats, he'll deal with me." They got Sarah and her daughter settled in Clara's old room, then gathered in the kitchen to discuss their next steps. The arson attack had changed everything. This was no longer just about illegal ordinances or women's rights. Someone had committed a serious crime, and that gave them leverage. "We report this to the territorial marshal," Cade said decisively. "Fire setting is a federal offense. They'll have to investigate." "But we can't prove it was Morrison or his men," Clara pointed out. "We don't have to prove it yet. We just have to create enough questions that the marshal has to come out here, look around, ask questions. Once he's involved, Morrison loses control of the narrative." Over the next days, events unfolded rapidly. The territorial marshal did indeed arrive, a stern man named Coleman who took the arson seriously. He interviewed Clara and Cade, examined the evidence, then headed to Black Hollow to ask questions. His investigation uncovered more than just the fire. Talking to townspeople, he heard stories about Morrison's ordinances, about women being forcibly returned to abusive husbands, about the climate of fear the sheriff had created. And once people started talking, they couldn't seem to stop. Emma Dalton provided testimony. So did several other women who'd attended Clara's meeting. Even some of the men spoke up, not in support of Morrison, but expressing concern that the town's reputation was being damaged by extremist policies. Marshal Coleman returned to the ranch 2 weeks later with news. The territorial governor is sending a special investigator, he announced. Morrison's ordinances violate multiple territorial and federal laws. They'll be rescinded, and Morrison himself is being removed from office pending investigation into his conduct. Clara felt tears of relief prick her eyes. It's really over? The legal part, yes, but changing hearts and minds takes longer. Coleman's expression was serious. Black Hollow is going to need new leadership, people who understand that frontier justice doesn't mean frontier tyranny, and some folks there are going to resist change every step of the way. But at least now women will have legal recourse, Cade said. They'll know their rights are protected under law, not just at their husband's whim. Coleman nodded. Speaking of which, I need to talk to Mrs. Brennan. Her husband filed a complaint claiming she kidnapped their daughter. I need her statement for the record. Sarah gave her testimony clearly and calmly, showing the marshal her fading bruises and describing years of escalating abuse. Coleman took detailed notes, then assured her that her husband's complaint would be dismissed and that she'd have full legal support if she chose to formally separate. You're a brave woman, Coleman told Sarah before he left. Not many have the courage to break free. I'm not brave, Sarah replied quietly. I'm just tired of being afraid. Mrs. Mercer showed me that was possible. After Coleman departed, Claire found herself alone with Sarah on the porch, watching the autumn sun set over the valley. What will you do now? Claire asked. Now that you're free to choose. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I think I'd like to stay here if you'll have us. Learn what you've learned, how to survive, how to be strong, how to build a life that's my own. Maybe eventually I'll move on, find my own place. But for now, I need to heal. We both do. Clara looked at Sarah's daughter, playing in the yard with a lightness the child hadn't shown when she first arrived. You're both welcome here for as long as you need, and when you're ready to leave, we'll help you find a good situation, a fresh start. Over the following months, the ranch became something of a refuge. Other women from Black Hollow came, some staying temporarily while escaping bad situations, others just visiting to talk and learn and find community. Clara taught them what she knew about frontier survival, about self-reliance, about discovering strength they didn't know they possessed. Margaret Bishop became a regular visitor, helping to coordinate what was essentially an informal network of support for frontier women. They called it practical education, but everyone understood it was really about empowerment, about giving women options beyond accepting whatever life handed them. Black Hollow itself underwent significant changes. Morrison was officially removed from office and charged with several crimes related to his abuse of authority. A new sheriff was elected, a fair-minded man who believed in equal application of the law. The illegal ordinances were formally rescinded, and while some men grumbled about outside interference, most seemed relieved to return to a more reasonable governance. Emma Dalton continued her work as a teacher, but also became an informal advocate for women's rights, speaking at gatherings and helping women understand their legal protections. She eventually married a young rancher who valued her intelligence and independence, a partnership that echoed Clara and Cade's in its foundation of mutual respect. Winter came again, Clara's second at the ranch, but this time she faced it with very different circumstances. Her pregnancy advanced, her body growing round and heavy with the life inside her. Cade worried constantly, having hired the best midwife he could find and making contingency plans for every possible complication. I'm going to be fine, Clara assured him repeatedly. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my wife carrying my child, Cade replied stubbornly. That's happening for the first time, and I'm allowed to be concerned. The baby came on a clear February morning, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Clara's water broke while she was feeding chickens, and suddenly everything became urgent and real. Cade rode like a demon to fetch the midwife while Sarah stayed with Clara, helping her through the early contractions. The labor was long and difficult, nearly 20 hours of exhausting work that left Clara wrung out and wondering if she'd survive. But when she finally heard her baby's first cry, when the midwife placed a tiny, perfect daughter in her arms, every moment of pain became worthwhile. "She's beautiful," Cade breathed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he looked at his daughter. "Clara, she's perfect." The baby had Cade's dark hair and Clara's eyes, and a set of lungs that suggested she'd inherited her mother's determination. They named her Emma, after both Clara's lost sister and the young woman whose courage had sparked so much change. Margaret and Thomas arrived the next day, bringing gifts and congratulations. Emma Dalton came too, laughing at having a namesake and immediately falling in love with the baby. "She's going to grow up knowing she can be anything," Emma said, cradling the infant gently. "She'll never doubt her worth or her strength because she'll see it modeled every day by her mother." Clara, exhausted but glowing with joy, watched Cade hold their daughter with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He was singing softly to the baby, some old frontier ballad, and the look on his face was one of absolute wonder. This, Clara thought, was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just love or partnership or even motherhood individually, but all of it woven together, a life built on honesty and respect and the freedom to be fully herself. As spring arrived and baby Emma grew from a tiny newborn into an alert, curious infant, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she'd been standing under an oak tree in Black Hollow, believing herself unworthy of love or respect or happiness. Now she was Clara Mercer, wife, mother, rancher, and inadvertent catalyst for change. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. The network of women they'd helped had grown into something resembling a movement, with frontier wives across the territory supporting each other and demanding better treatment. Black Hollow had transformed from a place of oppression into something more balanced, though the change was gradual and imperfect. One warm afternoon in late spring, Clara carried Emma outside to where Cade was working with the horses. Their daughter had just started smiling, and Cade would drop everything to make her laugh. "There are my girls," he said, abandoning his work immediately to join them on the porch. Clara settled beside him, Emma cradled between them, and looked out over the valley that had become her home. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Choosing me that day in Black Hollow? All the complications that came with it?" Cade looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Regret choosing the woman who became my partner in every sense? Regret finding someone who made me remember what living instead of just surviving felt like? Regret creating this beautiful life we've built together?" He shook his head firmly. "Never. Not for a single moment. Even though I brought trouble, even though helping those women in Black Hollow nearly got us killed, especially because of that." Cade shifted Emma so he could take Clara's hand. "You didn't just save yourself when you came here, Clara. You reminded me that life could have purpose beyond simple survival. You showed an entire community that women deserve respect and dignity, and you gave me hope that our daughter will grow up in a world slightly better than the one we inherited." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the weight of their sleeping daughter between them, the peace of a moment that was simple and perfect. "I love you," she said quietly. "I don't say it enough, but I do. Completely." "I know." Cade pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun track across the sky, occasionally interrupted by Emma's small sounds or the calls of birds settling in for the evening. It was an ordinary moment, unremarkable in its simplicity. But to Clara, it was everything. This was the life she'd built from scraps and courage, from choosing to take a chance on a scarred stranger who'd seen strength where everyone else saw weakness. This was the family she'd never dared to hope for, the partnership she hadn't known to want, the happiness she'd been told she didn't deserve. She thought about that girl under the oak tree sometimes, about how terrified and small she'd felt. If she could go back and tell her younger self what was coming, the hardship and fear, but also the joy and growth and love, would that girl have believed her? Probably not. But she would have hoped, and hope, Clara had learned, was where all transformation began. As the sun set over the Mercer Ranch, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Clara held her daughter close and felt her husband's steady presence beside her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work to be done, new battles to be fought. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, and the changes they'd helped spark in Black Hollow would need constant tending to take root. But tonight, in this perfect moment, Clara allowed herself to simply be grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the courage she'd found to claim her own worth, for the love that had grown from the most unlikely soil, and for the future that stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise. She was Clara Mercer, once the girl nobody wanted, now the woman who'd discovered that strength came in many forms, that love could be built on partnership and respect, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to believe the lies others told about your worth. And she was finally, completely, undeniably happy. The story of Clara and Cade Mercer became something of a legend in frontier territories. People spoke of the couple who'd defied convention, who'd built a marriage on mutual respect rather than traditional roles, who'd sparked a quiet revolution simply by living honestly and treating each other as equals. But for Clara herself, the legend mattered less than the reality. Waking each morning beside a man who valued her, raising a daughter who would never doubt her own strength, living a life that was hard and beautiful and entirely her own. She'd been chosen once, on a dusty day in Black Hollow, by a man who saw her potential when no one else did. But more importantly, she'd chosen too. Chosen courage over fear, chosen growth over stagnation, chosen to become the woman she was always meant to be. And in the end, that choice, that daily decision to embrace her own worth and live authentically, was the real miracle. Not the public dance that silenced the gossips, not the dramatic confrontation with corrupt authority, but the quiet internal revolution that transformed a girl who believed herself worthless into a woman who knew, beyond any doubt, that she was enough. More than